Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Kill Your Heroes in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Kill Your Heroes. Chapter 66. The Sun Also Sets, Part I. They were waiting in the dark, he and Sasuke and Naruto, alongside Jiraiya and the Kaze Cage, and while his brother was a silent coil of near undetectable chakra and intent, Naruto was softly restless, though not to the extent that he felt the need to chide him for it. His control over the Kyuubi's chakra had become remarkable, but more remarkable yet was the man who'd replaced the brash and thoughtless boy. He only wished his brother had come so far. As for Itachi, his body was still and his chakra quiet in ways that would have been impossible a year ago, but his mind was uneasy in ways that were inexcusable in the face of the coming conflict. Itachi had tried to be satisfied with this, standing next to Sasuke in battle instead of against him, in the way he used to be satisfied with things, a complete and finished sort of feeling. A laying down of things, a preparation to let them go. He could not quite let go of Sakura's words before she'd left him, her in that stark uniform and with her dragon eyes unconflicted as she'd kissed him like it was both their first kiss and their last. That lack of hesitation, which had defined so much of their relationship, told him that she wouldn't relent on this thing that she asked of him. He had been too caught up in the kiss itself for it to sink deep and shake him as it later would. Emotional vulnerability like this was new to him. He wasn't certain he liked it, he was even less certain that he'd have had courage enough to express it, and wasn't that a strange thing? His eyes shifted to Sasuke, weighing. Thinking. Uncertain and feeling that it wasn't the time for uncertainties, especially for something that had been more idea than they'd ever had the time and opportunity for in reality. But ideas had worth and weight, else people would never fight for them. He just had to decide whether he was willing to let old dreams fade to embrace a new one. Kill Your Heroes. There was a liminal moment between night and day, when the sun was nothing more than a burning line on the horizon that cast bloody shadows on the bellies of the clouds. Sakura felt caught in that moment as she looked out over the city she was about to entrap, only instead of awaiting the breaking of dawn on a new day, she felt like she was about to pull down the night and drown in it. Or maybe cover this city in the color of that terrible bleeding sky. Perhaps she should have felt powerful, poised on one of the flying swords that Sai had created to minimize their profile in the sky, but all she could think was that her hands felt clammy and she might be sick if she thought too hard about what she was about to do. Not that she'd be able to avoid that, in the end. She was more the dragon than she'd ever been for any length of time, her antlers proudly jutting through her hood, her talons shifting against the ink that kept her from falling from the sky, her claws sharp as the wind tugged softly at her hands. The length of her tail draped over the sword and spilled over the side, her scales shimmering scarlet in the dawn. Deep inside, in a place invisible to human eyes, in the dark ocean where that pearl of natural chakra was usually spun tight, it had bloomed through her veins and she could feel the subtle pulse of it in her tearing teeth. Everything was in place already. The shells of people that once were had been filled with the elite of Suna's puppet corps in areas of high shinobi residency and were waiting for her to fall upon this city. In her mind's eye, she could almost see the others in their demi-human forms, like Kami or Yasha or Azura, their swords surrounding the city like the points of an evil star. Exhaling slowly, Sakura raised her hands and folded her fingers into a familiar hand sign. Invisible currents filled the space between them as her team became extensions of her power, natural chakra being fed into the link until their individual chakras welled over into the jutsu and formed something truly catastrophic. It built for only a moment, and in her mind's eye Sakura could see thunderclouds welling up, before the storm broke and it became a drowning city. She fed everything she remembered of drowning into the illusion, the strangely muted sounds, the burn of lungs desperate for air, the sear of water in sinus passages, the panic at searching for a surface she never found, the confusion and distortion of her fading vision. Even from high above the rooftops, she could hear the screaming begin, and Sakura imagined the illusion pouring deep inside them like the water would have. The puppet corps had been supplied with some drug that was probably lethal in large doses to jolt them from the genjutsu, but there were thousands upon thousands of minds that had been unprepared for this attack. A real sage would have sensed when they began to die. Swathes of the young and the old and the weak finished before any blow could be struck by a puppet master, but Sakura wasn't a sage. She was something else, and she did not regret that as she watched the slaughter begin. Tsunade-sama's orders had made clear that they weren't to target the civilians directly, and so long as they remained unconscious inside their homes that would be more easily accomplished, but it had been made equally clear that they weren't to curb their techniques for fear of injuring bystanders. Uncurbed puppet masters were monsters. She had seen it in Sasori, and now, on a scale both smaller and grander, she was seeing it again as the sun rose over AIM. Sakura tore her attention from the streets below, meaning to turn her gaze to their next target as Operation Cloudburst softened the defenses of the city and opened paths to their true destination, that four-faced tower that loomed over AIM's skyline. Her eyes caught on the sky and the moon that hung in it, in a sky full of dawn, too full and too close and coming down, and she was eclipsed, caught between present and possibility. Sakura had the same sense she had when she stepped between with Hiration, a suspended moment that was outside of time as she knew it. She was still the dragon, more the dragon even, with the concealing uniform gone and in its place the kind of regalia that emphasized the non-human characteristics of a spirit. When she shifted her head, bells chimed softly from where they hung on her antlers. The garments she wore were the red and white of traditional Shinto, though there was an element of armor to them as well. Vaguely, like the ghost of one of her genjutsu, she saw the others similarly attired, their eyes as wide and wary as she felt, but though she saw them speaking, no words reached her ears. Sakura stood inside a space bound by Shimenawa, in front of a small shrine on a rocky white plain that stretched as far as the eye could see. She had just begun to wonder if this was a genjutsu turned against her. Against them she had felt none of the dissonance, but until the end, Gozen-san had been able to keep her trapped in them, at least for a little while, when between one blink and the next, a woman had appeared in front of her. She looked as if she'd stepped from some story, perhaps the same story that Sakura and the others were dressed for, clad in junito and with her white hair long and loose down her back and spilling over the trailing hem of her robes. The outermost of her 12 layers was white with elaborate patterns woven into the silk itself, below which was a layer of regal purple, then purple of a different shade, transitioning slowly toward a pale blue like the heart of winter, and darker blue hakama beneath it all. A gauzy scarf of pale moon gold silk floated about her like a signal of divinity. In her hands there was a closed fan. Her eyes were Hyuga eyes, but the third eye on her forehead was cherry non-red, and she had horns like branches. "Hello, child," she said, and her voice echoed oddly in this space that wasn't he. "Hello," said Sakura cautiously. The woman observed her silently, and Sakura took the opportunity to attempt to break the genjutsu, if an illusion it was, but the world surrounding her didn't so much as ripple. "You wear the dragon well," she said. "And the companions you have tied to you are strong and balanced." This one worried. After so many years of stillness, one begins to fear movement, lest one unbalance the world. You were the one who finished the seal," Sakura hazarded, both alarmed at this and feeling that this was a much more reasonable explanation than it having become functional on its own. The woman inclined her head ever so slightly. "This one did so." "Why?" Sakura asked, when the woman made no further explanation. "Who are you?" "This one was once called Atsutsuki Kagaya." "Once. A name can become a chain to bind one," she replied, adding after a thoughtful pause, "There has been no one who called this one anything for a very long time. Tsukuyomi no Mikato's realm is a silent one." "Oh," Sakura said, startled, "then, why? Why did you finish the seal?" "There are perhaps stories of this one, if you searched for them, though with the erosion of time and the fallibility of human memory, who can say what has become of them? Even before this one ceased listening to the echoes from the earth, they had become largely lies," she said flatly, pale eyes narrowed in a show of temper from a face that had been almost as still as a no mask. "Meant to enforce the order of this world, to vilify powerful women and glorify the violence of men. The most enduring lies, however, are anchored with truths. You are not interested in this one's history. You are concerned with the history that is even now being written. This one retired from the world long ago, but this one's descendants live on as mortals do, incarnating in the cycle of souls. Their memories might be shed like the outgrown skin of cicadas in each cycle, but the core of their self remains. Their ambitions. Their antagonistic relationship. And the disaster that follows even their best of intentions. They walk in the human world now," she warned. "This one can feel the tremors of their passing, but there is something more to it now, something that feels as if it might shake this realm to its roots. Chakra gathers. And quietly, beneath the clamor, someone this one hoped to never hear from again. Akatsuki. They're gathering the tailed beasts. Their leader intends to use the thread of their power to force peace upon the world. A slow blink. The world moves in cycles. There are few new things in it. This foolishness has been tried before. It will be tried again. And it will not go as they think it will. This one suspects that what this one feared is in motion, that this Akatsuki unknowingly serves the plan of something much older than themselves. What kind of plan? Sakura asked, as jarred in her comfortable worldview by this strange conversation as she had been by her first venture into death. Only this time, her emotions weren't tepid and tamped down, they jangled, vacillating between suspicion. Sakura was Sakura and therefore of note to herself and not beings like this woman, whatever she was, in a sort of resignation born of Tatsuo's warning and a childhood full of improbable and terrible happenings. Why warn me? Rare is the human who dares make use of natural chakra. Rarer yet are those that survive it. Most seem to call upon it only during their battle meditation, and this one speaks to you only through the energy that touches all things and binds realms. So, when you ask this one why, it is because you opened yourself to the hearing, and this one admired the strength of will and daring that this one sensed in your song. This one sleeps deeply and no longer watches over the earth or listens to voices such as people speak in. This one cannot give you the faces or the fullness of their plan. This one has no will to wake, but if they manage to do so, this is true, when gods war, it is humans that suffer. She raised the hand that held the fan slowly, with the kind of deliberate grace that characterized temple dances. Sakura almost flinched when it pressed against her forehead, in echo of the third eye that was less than metaphysical on the woman in front of her. "Open your eyes, child," the woman commanded. "Be wary of those of this one's mortal line, but beware most the one who, when this one ate of the fruit, began to gnaw at the roots." Sakura opened her eyes and discovered herself still perched on a sword above a Megakure, and the sense of dissonance and displacement was so great for a moment it was like in the first, worst days after wave. What the fuck was that? Anko-san's voice was strident and shaken over the calm, breaking radio silence. "Teiko?" Kakashi-senpai's voice asked as Sakura clenched her teeth and tried to refocus on the present. "Is everything alright?" "No," she thought. "No, it isn't." "One disaster at a time," she told herself grimly, collecting herself and giving the order. "Operation Cloudburst is complete. Rendezvous for Operation Dawnbreaker." Various acknowledgements came across the line, and as Sakura began to manipulate the sword beneath her feet, missing the reassurance breadth of a beast though they too would have been nothing more than ink and chakra and will, she briefly switched channels to report that her unit was moving in and duly received an acknowledgement. For Operation Dawnbreaker, their destination was the peak of that monolith. Tsunade-sama had decided to take full advantage of their aerial capabilities and ordered that they would put pressure in place from above to flush the members of Akatsuki downwards and hopefully limit dramatic last stands carried out in crumbling edifices many dozens of feet about street level. There had been something very dry about the way she'd said those words that spoke of personal experience. The tower only grew uglier as she approached, all exposed pipes and human faces like something out of an architect's fever dream. Antennae bristled on the highest roofs, and as the others came within shouting distance, Sakura gestured brusquely at them. "Take them out." Frustrated and very probably feeling the same fear that coursed through her veins, the others obeyed with alacrity. Sakura was glad for the feel of steel shearing beneath her hands. If she felt shaky and sick and very much like she wished that had never happened, well, those were all familiar things. Once, she'd learned not to drown in an ocean of fear. Now rage washed up, and she was certain in that moment that if she screamed, it would not be a human sound. Instead, she shoved more natural chakra down the invisible pathways the seal had set between her team. Concrete and rebar gave way beneath the white coils of Anko-san's summoned snakes, which had coiled themselves around the narrow, maintenance access rooms that comprised the top floors of the tower. They'd briefly discussed using snakes to bring the whole tower down, but while her summons were spirits of a sort, they weren't made of stone. Their bodies weren't designed to crush hard things like this. Even if they managed it, it would be slow going as very obvious targets, and they'd agreed to begin their assault by disrupting any communication equipment housed atop the tower. Sakura's tail lashed behind her as the clouds above AIM began to gather in earnest, the winds beginning to tear at them. They'd all retreated slightly to avoid the crumbling walls, and Kakashi-senpai held up a forestalling hand to keep them from regrouping. "I should be able to cut the power," he said, leaping easily from his sword to the rubble that remained atop the tower. "Since our Dragon Lord has been so generous in sharing her chakra." His hands flowed through a series of hand signs she was unfamiliar with, ending with one hand upturned to the green-black sky. Lightning sparked along the clouds, then erupted downward like a lance, caught ever so briefly in Kakashi-senpai's waiting hand before he thrust it down into the building below his feet. It crackled and arched and screamed as it made the building shudder, and all the wiring and lights exploded in sparks. Then a more powerful explosion made the building quiver as a main went. Darkness fell in the blocks surrounding the tower. "Hell of a move, hey take," Anko-san called out admiringly, to which Kakashi-senpai replied with a jaunty two-fingered salute, ears tipped forward and tail curled up slightly. "And look, we've got a guest." Konan, Sakura recalled from their dossiers. A stern, almost sad-looking woman with her blue hair in an elegant twist and a large origami flower in her hair. Large paper-white wings arched out behind her shoulders, rustling softly. She was awe-inspiring, powerful, and serene. They were on her in an instant. Size animals focused their attack on her wings, plucking and picking and pulling, but each feather they tore away refolded itself and became a knife. Black ink coated their paper blades as she slaughtered the beasts without so much as raising a hand. When all was finished there were only papers floating on the breeze. Sakura launched herself from her sword only moments after she'd thrown the first of her anchor kunao, gone neither here nor there almost before her claws cleared the ink, and she channeled her least favorite element into one of her knives as she came up low behind Konan. Waves of heat eddied from the fire that trailed behind her movement, scorching as she carved a path from the liver to the spine with one head while she reached out to mark her with the other. Or she would have, had the flesh not split and peeled in layers of burning paper. Sakura glimpsed the patterns too late to do more than shout tag. And shove herself backwards into the most uncoordinated gyration she'd ever stumbled through, reappearing just behind Kakashi-senpai on a sword not intended for two people as an explosion rocked the rubble she'd been standing on. "Nice of you to drop by," Kakashi-senpai said mildly as she crouched behind him to regain her balance, tail looped around the hilt of the sword, before he shoved off toward the building. At the same time Niji-san leaped forward to do the same, preferring the limited but solid space atop the tower to attempting mid-air combat. Sai had renewed his assault, flocks of ravens and crows trying to peel away Konan's defenses, and she spared him just enough attention send a hail of papers that whirled around him briefly before detonating. Sakura hesitated only long enough to see that he was still conscious and the tattoos concealed beneath his uniform spilled out in a whole array of winged things, more exotic than usual. In order to combat similar explosions atop the tower, Kakashi-senpai and Niji-san were fighting back to back, the latter with his wings pulled tight to his body to keep them from interfering with his rotation. Of the group, Niji found his demi-human form the most limiting, but only because Anko-san had gotten very good at making certain she had a tail instead of becoming a snake from the waist down. Sakura had no idea how she'd accomplished it, force of will, maybe, and the same kind of resolve that had earned her Orochimaru's respect. They were testing Konan by trying to close. They had less information on the combat abilities of Konan than almost anyone else in the group. Itaki had never had occasion to train or spar with the Angel of Aim. Konan was making papier-mâché of the most formidable defense of the Hyuga clan, likely intending to crush them when the rotation finished, but Kakashi-senpai had always been and would always be better with fire than Sakura was. It erupted outwards and then curled into the form of snarling dragons that launched themselves at Konan, who unfolded for lack of a better term and reappeared in the sky across from them, only to be met with a barrage of size creatures. He'd used the time she'd spent keeping the others at bay to reinforce their numbers. Konan seemed to hardly pay him any mind, splattering each of his creations like they were flies as the others tried their best to keep from catching each other in their jutsu. Kakashi-senpai was especially dangerous in this respect, with a nigh unlimited supply of chakra being fed through their connection. His whole repertoire was at his disposal and senpai had stolen more jutsu than most shinobi knew existed. Where Sakura had the kind of chakra control that put any technique within her reach with dedicated study, Kakashi-senpai was raw talent compounded with the addition of a Sharingan and in some sense of the word, that made him a monster. One leashed by duty and dry humor, but as rebel rose in the form of hounds that opened glowing eyes and sprouted fur of fire as they took their first steps into the air, a monster all the same. The flames that spilled from them began red, but in the few seconds it took for them to cross to Konan, they had begun to blaze blue and the papers suspended in the air began to burst into flame simply from proximity. When she tried to escape by teleporting using her paper technique, Kakashi-senpai opened a series of black gates around them and Sakura, Anko-san, and Niji-san cooperated to try to push her through them, returning to the sky when Konan tried to take advantage of her ability to take to the air. She kept slipping through their hands, however, simply shedding paper as they searched for her real body, which proved elusive even when Kakashi-senpai's hounds began to circle around Konan, chasing in tighter and tighter circles that culminated in a knot that looked like the sun and raised the sky in an explosive ring that boiled away the lowest hanging clouds. Konan resorted to greater and greater collections of explosive tags that forced them to retreat, creating a war of attrition between them, one that frustrated Sakura, whose skill set was meant to end battles quickly, not make confetti. Though she could make a lot of confetti very quickly, if that would have simply multiplied the weapons of their opponent. Though her frustration wasn't equal to Niji-san's, who was muttering to himself about chakra dispersion loudly enough she could hear him even without being on the mic. Their row allowed for mass destruction and civilian casualties, but they'd refrained from truly massive jutsu to avoid potential friendly fire as other teams arrived, including the team meant to enter the tower from the bottom in search of Akatsuki's leader. The idea was becoming tempting, however, as the battle raged on. It had probably been less than 10 minutes since they'd engaged, but it felt like forever. Then Konan stopped, her face seized in an expression of pain. "That's the thing about ink," Sai said as the black seeped along her skin and along her wings. "It gets everywhere if you aren't careful." Her wings shredded themselves, becoming black chains that slithered around her body and bound her, and Kakashi-senpai ripped open another hole in the world that she no longer had the power to escape or avoid. "That's one," Sakura said when it was finished. "And whatever's still out there is worse. Kill your heroes." Chapter 67. The Sun Also Sets, Part 2. This have anything to do with our freak visitation? Or mass hallucination or whatever the hell that woman was? Anko asked. "Looked like she was saying something to you, but damned if I could make it out." Sakura briefly described what had been said to her even as she used a combination of jutsu and chakra-enhanced strength to open a passage into the tower. "So, there's maybe someone or something out there worse than that bastard who turned death upside down and inside out." "That's just fucking fantastic," Anko-san snorted. "That just makes my day. I mean, who doesn't want to have a seal on them that functions because of some sleeping goddess decided she'd rather not wake up to deal with her own shit? The second we're done slaughtering this city, I'm out." Also, her warning was very annoyingly vague. Niji-san contributed as he preceded them. "You're not wrong," Sakura muttered. "Niji, see anything that'll let us deal with the terrors of today instead of whatever else is out there?" "There's someone 3 floors down," he said. Judging by the equipment around him, it seems like it was some sort of life support system that failed when Heitake-senpai took out the power. His chakra, though it's monstrous and strange and the frequency keeps shifting. "Whoever it is, they're dangerous and beginning to move." Sakura hummed thoughtfully, reaching out her own senses to detect the daunting life force that felt well. She lacked the sort of experience with sensory skills that would have come with being a real sage, but this man's energy was like a star on the brink of collapse. Fragile, but entirely capable of destroying them all even with his death. "We gonna bust through the floors," Anko said with a grin in her voice. "Drop in and say hello." "No. We're linked together," Sakura said with a smile that was all teeth. "We're just going to step through." "Sakura," Kakashi-senpai said sharply, "don't tell me you're going to try to take us though. Especially without an anchor." "Trust me, senpai," she replied. "If you could sense this guy, you'd know that I can't miss." "Have you ever taken anyone through with you?" Sai asked. She didn't reply, reaching out to snag Senpai and Niji before anyone had time to protest, flashing back an instant later to bring the other 2 through, landing with her feet spread wide, tail scraping across the floor and talons catching at the tiles as she anchored herself. Her knives were in her hands as she faced the terror she'd sensed. It was a man, the husk of one, his bones grotesquely pushing up against his skin and his back bristling with black metal. She was not Naruto. There were no questions. No conversations. No accusations. Just the charge, her genjutsu shredding around him like a hurricane through tissue paper, dead eyes meeting hers as she leaped and found herself slammed to the ground like she'd been struck by the hand of a god. The sound that escaped her wasn't human, it was the snarl of a struck beast. But this animal had allies and they swept in where she fell. Sakura ignored the grind and crunch as her ribs shifted and set with the chakra that burned through her blood, launching herself forward. She left one knife where it lay so that she could signal to the others and they shifted their strategy according to her orders, Niji falling half a step behind so that the others could open the way for him to seal their opponent's chakra. They closed swiftly, the frail body in front of them their only saving grace against the ominous and overwhelming force of this man's chakra. She couldn't imagine what it might have been like to fight this kind of monster in a healthy body. As it was, he moved like an old man and hit like a typhoon, each twitch of his skeletal fingers producing some new jutsu. In moments, a great gout of fire produced without breath, but instead with a complex fold of his fingers had scorched away half of Anko's uniform. Scales bubbled up out of her skin like blisters, white in the dark of the room, but she didn't so much as flinch. Son of a bitch! She roared as she struck, but her attack landed on air that had solidified into a shield. Sai, who hadn't run forward, who'd instead leaped back to give himself space, hit him with a rush of crows that obscured Sakura's leap, which put her above their enemy and perhaps the shield that had foiled Anko's attack. She used two jutsu almost simultaneously, the floor closing up like the jaws of a beast while teeth of air snapped shut above it. Both stilled centimeters from his skin, but as the air jutsu dissipated, Niji was there to fill the space. Only her dragon eyes allowed her to track the movement of his hands, Kakashi-senpai coming from nowhere to restrain their opponent's hands as Niji sealed his tenketsu. It's not working. He shouted in warning. I can't seal him. Another blast of air sent them hurtling for the walls, but Sakura managed to catch her footing on the ceiling, using her tail to help launch herself toward the red-haired menace. He tilted his head back and his ringed eyes locked on hers. The beast that appeared between them was mostly teeth, and those teeth tore through her shoulder, smashing her against the ceiling and trying to crush her. Teiku! Sakura! Hag! Don't you dare let him kill you, kid! I won't. There was chakra spilling up out of the sea in her belly, a wild hot wave of it, and it felt like something in her forehead cracked open when she roared. The sky she could see the sky and the moon looking down on them. A huge chunk of the tower had been blasted away and with her hyper-attuned senses, she heard the creak and shift of the upper floors as they began to topple forward. Now that wasn't enough wall to support them. Get out! She screamed and her team scattered. Sakura launched herself at her fallen knives, throwing one into the sky with enough force it was a star falling up and snatched it before it could begin to give in to gravity. Her feet settled on solid air, eyes straining as she searched for signs of her team. She saw Sai first, billowing black clouds bearing him up as birds circled him defensively. A flash of red gold in her peripheral vision proved to be Niji's wings beating in strong, sure strokes. Kakashi-senpai hadn't gotten as much height, but he appeared to be freely using wind-style attacks to control his fall before landing atop the remains of the tower. Anko was already there, the shredded remains of her uniform clinging to the white scales that now covered much of her body. So was their enemy. As Sakura's nictitating membrane drew across her eyes, golden light flared in a lower window before Naruto burst out of it, glowing like the sun and rising freely in the air as Garasama's sand poured out of the building, bearing him aloft. Sasuke was only a step behind, with Itaka following closely, sprinting up the side of the building. Fearmonger, Sakura shouted, withdraw. Leave this battle to them. As ineffective as their own attacks had been, the other group would need to make use of their most devastating jutsu, some of which would put their allies at risk as well as their enemies if they kept too close. Not that she really thought Sasuke would hold back for fear of friendly fire, but there was no need to make this difficult for the other squad. Sakura? Naruto asked in surprise as his gaze shot upward. Sakura blinked again, properly this time, because aside from the golden corona of chakra that covered him, Naruto was overlaid by a hazy image like the ghost of a genjutsu. It was a man in white, wearing a bandana around his forehead and small sections of hair bundled on either side of his face. Something shifted on her forehead, less painfully than last time when it had felt as if her skull had split open and the image disappeared, but not before she noticed that there had been another man in white overlaying Sasuke. Sakura let herself fall, landing in a crouch beside Senpai. Taking in the shocked expression on their faces, it occurred to her then that none of them had seen her in this form before leaping toward another building, tail snapping behind her like a banner. She sensed her team falling in behind her. The battle wasn't finished yet. Kill your heroes. It took 3 days before Tsunade-sama accepted Omegakure's surrender. It hadn't taken them that long to crush the will of the village that had happened within hours of their assault, but it had taken their shinobi that long to regroup sufficiently as to offer it. "What do you mean you lost track of Nagato?" Sakura asked flatly. She'd since been briefed on the identity of the man they'd encountered in the tower, whose description they'd lacked because Itake had never met the mysterious leader of Akatsuki in person. Given his physical condition, Sakura could see why he'd chosen not to reveal himself to the power-hungry S-class shinobi under his command. Hey, it's not our fault," Naruto protested. "We had him, we really did, Itake will tell you, when some weirdo in a mask teleported in and took him." "It was Toby again," Itake clarified. "The man either masquerading as Uchiha Madara or, possibly, actually Uchiha Madara. Whatever the case, his Sharingan technique makes him extremely difficult to track and we were unable to pursue." "That man was as good as a corpse anyway," Sasuke added gruffly. "A corpse with an extremely valuable jujutsu," Sakura retorted acidly. "He and Zetsu attempted to retrieve Itake's body after your battle with him as well. It's highly unlikely that they haven't got a plan for it." Sasuke's scowl said that he knew she was right, but that he wasn't going to admit it. "Some of my sand had already settled in Nagato's clothes when they took him. I've expended a great deal of chakra during the last 3 days, but once I've had time to rest, I should be able to track him," Gaara volunteered. "For now, though, we have a victory," Tsunade-sama said sharply. "We did what we set out to do. Omegakure has fallen. The power of Akatsuki is broken. All this while incurring remarkably few casualties on our side and doing so with only the assistance of Suna. Our forces will withdraw by afternoon and return to Konohagakure immediately, so that no one gets any bright ideas. They might have been unwilling to help, but the other great shinobi countries will certainly feel threatened by our actions here. Especially yours, Fearmonger." There were only 2 members of her squad present, Kakashi-senpai and herself, for this informal debriefing, which included Gaara, Naruto, Sasuke, Itake, and Jiraiya, but she felt gazes turn toward her regardless. "Yeah. That was something else, Sakura-chan," Naruto said with only a fraction of his usual enthusiasm, one hand gripping his opposite sleeve and his smile stilted. She was certain that using genjutsu like that, rendering the enemy helpless and denying them the opportunity to fight back, violated some part of Naruto's strange chivalric code. She was actually more surprised he wasn't vocally outraged about it, but maybe he too realized that he'd rather it be a one-sided slaughter than a proper war. Or maybe it was just that he'd done as much growing up as she had and not everything he thought spilled immediately out of his mouth. "Right now, Gaara is the only one capable of tracking Toby, but we won't let him risk following him without the support of Konoha Shinobi. Witch and Hound are the obvious choices for this. Harano, Fearmonger was formed under your leadership and you performed flawlessly in that role during your time here, but Haytake has superior experience when it comes to tracking, so he'll be in charge of the Konoha contingent for this next mission." "I don't have any objections to that, ma'am," Sakura asked. "Is Fearmonger being officially dissolved?" "You have my permission to do so. You can send home any of the members who'd like to return, the others are free to accompany you. You will be joined by Naruto and both are Uchiha, because whether he's actually Uchiha Madara or not, your target is certainly dangerous." Her lips compressed into a thin, unhappy line. "I won't pretend that it's going to be an easy fight, even if you are able to locate him. Zetsu, who remains at large, may or may not be accompanying him. I'm sorry to send you on another S-class mission so soon, but this is necessary if we're going to have any chance of attacking him before he decides to strike back at us. Don't you worry, Tsunade-baa-chan. We'll get him," Naruto said gravely, slamming one fist into his palm. Kill your heroes. Chapter 68. Gammon, Part I. Sakura had slept less than 6 hours in the last 3 days, so she intended to tell Madarashi-san and the rest of Fearmonger that they were free and then find some dead man's bed and sleep in it. Her team would be among the last to leave and didn't have a logistical role in the withdrawal. So when Sasuke slunk after her, Naruto bouncing alongside, she scowled. "Man, Sakura-chan, what was that form?" Naruto asked. "I didn't get a good look, but you were standing on thin air. And it almost looked like you had a tail." Sakura sighed and, deciding that activating the seal would be the quickest way to quench his curiosity, did so. As her antlers came in fully, she felt the telltale pull that indicated Kakashi-senpai had followed her lead. There wasn't any strange overlay when she looked at Naruto this time, but it was hard to be a source of mystery when you were gaping that unattractively. Tail whirling behind her as she turned to face him properly, she took in Sasuke's wide eyes and Itachi's narrow-eyed stare. "Think of it as a combination of Sage Mode and Sasuke's cursed seal," she said. "Who gave you that kind of power?" Sasuke asked, grimacing when Itachi cut him a sharp look. "Was it you?" he asked as he looked behind him to Kakashi-senpai, going stiff when he noticed the silver ears. Noticing Sasuke's consternation, Naruto turned as well, his jaw dropping impossibly lower as he took in the sight of their former teacher. "Wait, that was you up there too, Kakashi-sensei." Kakashi-senpai's tail wished once. "You caught me," he said drolly. "And, no, I didn't teach Sakura how to do this, Sasuke. It's the other way around. She's my Orochimaru." He let the stunned silence hang between them for a beat, before, "The good news is that I've yet to experience delusions of grandeur and the ambition to crush countries that have annoyed me in the past." Sakura sighed, pinching the bridge of nose in such a way that kept her claws clear of her face. "Someone showed me, let's call it a map to the path, Sasuke," she said at last. "But I did the rest, with some help from a friend." "Not that you'd know anything about that," she remarked darkly. Let's focus on the fact that you can fly before you two start trying to kill each other again," Naruto said with a nervous laugh. "I'm sure what Sasuke meant to say was that you were amazing, Sakura-chan. I didn't even know Genjutsu could have that sort of range, and while we didn't see much of your fights, the stories they're telling are so cool." "You're amazing," he said earnestly. "You're not bad yourself," she said lightly. "Especially considering you were stuck with him." A head tilt indicated the scowling Uchiha. Then she remembered she was an adult and they were no longer supposed to be antagonists. She grimaced, which probably made her look like a Kirinin with her teeth as they were, and said, "Sorry. That was uncalled for. I haven't had much sleep and I'm frustrated at the way things turned out." "I'm not blaming you," she said swiftly when Sasuke would have made some sort of retort. "There's a reason that we handed that battle off to the four of you. Even if you nearly brought down a few buildings on our heads. And that chakra construct was something else." "That was Itachi," Sasuke volunteered stiffly. Sakura turned her attention to her something, who was still studying her. He stepped closer, reaching out slowly to caress the curve of an antler. "It's sort of cute," he said with a slight smile. She didn't recognize the embarrassed, half-strangled noise that elicited, which only tugged his smile wider. His hair wasn't worn in a low ponytail as he normally wore it, it was higher and only half pulled through the elastic, giving him something of a playful casualness and leaving the length of his neck bare. Even dusty and smudged, he looked so much better than the man she'd first met that he could have almost been another person entirely. It helped that he wasn't being swallowed up by an Akatsuki cloak or those civilian outfits he'd worn to seem non-threatening. Much like Senpai, he hadn't made many modifications to the standard uniform, except that he wore black rather than blue beneath the green. Probably he had done so as a show of solidarity, a reminder to those who saw them that the Uchiha once again served Konoha. She hadn't really missed him, she wasn't accustomed to having him at her side, like she was with Senpai, and there hadn't been a lot of time to miss much of anyone except her bed, and there had been a certain awareness that somewhere on the battlefield he fought for the same cause, but that didn't mean she wasn't glad to see him. A knot of anxiety she hadn't known she was carrying in her chest eased to see he was well. And there was a certain security in the knowledge that he would be with her on the next mission, as if with both Itachi and Kakashi-senpai at her side there was no way that they could fail. Given the kind of mission it was, that said something she wasn't certain she was ready to say yet. Itachi's eyes shifted thoughtfully between her and Senpai as they both deactivated the seal, Sakura shifting her head from side to side as the weight of the antlers vanished. "Seriously, though, I would kill for sleep," she quipped lightly, "so I'm off." She turned away, mind already set on the apartment blocks that the Konoha shinobi were occupying, feeling Kakashi-senpai fallen beside her. He already had his book open in one hand, the other tucked in his pocket. That was the way it should be, but she flexed the hand on her free side in invitation, Attack is pinky linking with her own as Naruto and Sasuke began to bicker behind them. Kill your heroes. Harano, Tsunade-sama said from where she stood atop the wreckage of what had been the tallest tower in Omegakure, arms crossed and expression pensive as she looked out across the destruction they had caused. The sky was blue and cloudless above them, a reminder that they'd removed the god of rain. The bulk of Konoha's forces had already withdrawn from the city. Within the hour the rest of them would be gone as well. She and Sai had been preparing to remove the seal from Mitarashi-san when the summons had come. Mitarashi-san had been adamant about having it off as soon as she heard that Tsunade-sama had given the go-ahead to dissolve Fearmonger. "Go Dame-sama," she acknowledged. "Things will change for you now," she said without preamble. "It was always a possibility that your identity would be discovered, but losing your mask with hair as distinctive as yours and then playing such a visible role in the combat afterwards, once word reaches the other villages, they'll reclassify you. Being an S-ranked shinobi is useful in some circumstances and a burden in others. Especially given your skill set, and because battles as one-sided as this give rise to bullshit nicknames like the Angel of Annihilation, thanks to your team's defeat of the Angel of Aim. We'll have to wait and see whether they decide to attempt to eliminate you or just whine every time you enter their borders." Sakura nodded and ignored the sick twist of her stomach, clenching her hands tighter against her opposite elbows. "Maybe if you're lucky, someone will declare you flee on sight. We haven't had a kunoichi earn that honor yet." "Unlikely," Sakura murmured. "Though I'm not looking forward to assassins, either. I was never enough of a name to bother with, before." "More fool them," was Tsunade-sama's reply. "But I didn't just call you up here to warn you about the benefits of your newfound fame. This won't end even in the success of your mission. What they started when they attacked Konohagakure won't be finished. It will take us years to recover from this. And they will be long years, hard ones, where once the immediate rage and passion ebbs, people will become restless, less selfless. They'll be angry. Hungry for what they had before and don't have now, and the time it's taking to have it again. For years we've shunted the duties of the military police to Umbu and others, but it's beyond time they were a visible presence in the village again. Your command experience is limited, but you've proven that you're composed and resourceful even when I ask you to crush a city, which proves to me that you can cope with stress and work within deadlines. The greater part of your time in the field has been spent doing investigation and pursuit, which is frankly ideal, and your newfound reputation will automatically accord you respect and fear. As a bonus, I don't doubt that doing this will mean that Hatake will actually accept what I'm going to offer him." Sakura regarded her Hokage warily, distrusting her reckless grin. "And just what are you going to offer him?" she asked after a moment. "I'm going to ask if he'd serve as vice commander of the military police. Normally I'd expect him to flee anything that looked like half that much paperwork, but he'd be working to support you, Harano, so he might make an exception. Danzu has already approved the choice, which means that the other elders will fall in line, though I doubt they'd have protested your appointment to begin with. Also, we're in a state of martial law, so what I fucking say goes." "You want me to become commander of the military police?" Sakura repeated faintly. Tsunade hummed an affirmation that sounded like a death knell to any dreams she'd entertained of sleeping for a month when they made it back to the village. The seal of the false sage had allowed her team to take advantage of the kind of chakra-bolstered healing seen in Jinchuriki, but she felt ragged and exhausted. She didn't want to think beyond this next mission. She had wanted to pretend to herself that soon there would be a time where time didn't seem to be rushing toward them with all the ominous and inescapable devastation of a tsunami. Like back when Team 7 was first formed. "Before you panic, that long peace we had between the war with IWA and now means that there were a lot of shinobi that needed to begin their transition from fieldwork anyway. I'll be able to fill your support roles with experienced ninja. You'll select your enforcers and your hunters and grow the organization until its ranks are as full as when the Uchiha filled them. If Hatake Kakashi says yes, you'll also win some transfers from Umbu." "People won't follow me," she protested through numb lips. I'm not Naruto. Or even Sasuke." Tsunade-sama turned an unimpressed look toward her. "Stop making excuses, kiddo. Especially bad ones. Just look at your team right now. That boy from Root lost his leg and still followed you down into the throat of the beast. Hatake Kakashi, who hasn't allowed people close since he was about chest high, is the kind of friend to you that few people ever find in their life, but he wouldn't do that if you weren't someone strong enough to survive being his friend. Mitarashi Anko's probably frothing at the mouth to be free of the seal, but that has to do with her and not with you as a leader. Orochimaru stole a whole hell of a lot of things from her. She'll get a promotion to full jounin status when we get back to the village for staring all her fears in the face like this to serve her village. And the Hyuga? Do you think you really could have talked him into taking the seal if you weren't suited to lead? I wouldn't really be surprised if he followed you into the military police if you asked. It suits his temperament and skills. This isn't really about what I want, is it? Sakura said softly. You're telling me what's already so. It's already done. Already. Yeah. Sorry. Life's like that, for people like you and me. I didn't want to be Hokage, either. Still don't. Unless you'd like that better? I'd let you, you know. Absolutely not, was Sakura's instant reply. And hey take? What do you think my chances are of talking him into it? You should only try if you're curious to see how long it takes him to resign his rank and become a homemaker. I thought so, Tsunade-sama sighed. I was mostly kidding about Haytake anyway. His reputation is too erratic for the village at large to trust him in the way they'll need to trust my successor. Stability, not strength, is what the poor soul that fills my seat will need to represent. And I'm not even certain Haytake remembers how to fill out most of the forms you've been filing for your team. Sakura laughed weakly, then gathered herself. She still had to tell the Hokage about that uncanny encounter with the goddess. Kill your heroes. Chapter 69. Gammon, Part 2. Itaki had asked to observe Mitarashi-san's seal removal. It was a mark of how eager she was to be free of it that Mitarashi-san didn't even bother to make her permission sound salacious. Listen, if you need helping fucking around with gods, that's fine, send me a message, but I'm not doing it with this seal on my skin. It was bad enough before some moonbitch started getting real vague about ominous shit, had been her response to Tsunade-sama's permission to dissolve Fearmonger. Sakura had experienced considerable pain as she'd integrated the layers of the seal of the false sage when they'd initially experimented with it, but none of her temporary team had complained of anything more than the discomfort of transformation when their seals had been applied. Judging by how pale Mitarashi-san had gone and the cold sweat that had broken out on her skin, it hurt considerably more to remove the seal. Shit, it feels like you're yanking out my veins, she hissed as her hands clenched on the chair she was straddling. Sorry, Sakura said tersely, hands spread wide across the seal, which had already had a bold red line slashed down it and characters of breaking and release inked alongside, but she hadn't yet activated them for fear that all the natural chakra that lay dormant within the false sage seal would flood uncontrolled through Mitarashi-san's meridians. We didn't look into removing these. They'd either work or they wouldn't, and if they worked and went really wrong, the chance was so high that it'd instantaneously kill you that we were more interested in building in mechanisms to survive that part than anything else. After that, we were just going to bind them and leave them dormant rather than risk further damage to the chakra system. And let's just say that our source was not as helpful as we would have liked. This is even more fucked up than I thought it was, Mitarashi-san groaned. Hag, I've been thinking, Sai commented levelly. Oh. Sakura replied as she tried to twist all the metaphysical strands of chakra that had settled into Mitarashi-san's meridians into a single cord she could smoothly pull out. When we're channeling at the capacity that we did during the battle, do you think the natural chakra-induced cellular regeneration would make it possible to regrow my leg if we cut it off where they healed it? Is it maybe possible we could talk about this another time? Sakura asked tightly, almost losing her hold on the chakra in her surprise. Mitarashi-san had resorted to muttering darkly under her breath, but Sakura took a deep breath and closed her eyes to the external noise and considered the issue as if it was just she and Sai first experimenting with the seal, with no deadline and no urgency. How did I collect natural chakra in the beginning? The answer was so blatantly obvious she was embarrassed, her eyes opening fractionally as she stared at the seal and began to rotate her chakra. Once the trailing ends of Mitarashi-san's natural energy were caught up in the more powerful tidal shift of her own, it was a quick thing to see it all dissolve into the reservoir of her own power. In that moment, she activated the breaking and Mitarashi-san made a sound that might have been a scream if it hadn't turned into the gurgling sound of someone being violently sick. Take a good look, Uchiha, she rasped when she'd finished heaving. It's easy to jump in. It's much harder to jump out. We're not a gang, Sakura muttered. And I doubt Itaka wants any part of this. And if I did? Itaki asked from where he'd been watching next to Senpai. Kakashi-senpai had been leaning against the wall, frowning over the top of his novel with his Sharingan eye activated, but at Itaka's admission turned his furrowed brows toward the younger man. Sakura might have gaped a little and even Niji-san looked surprised. Sai looked moderately interested, which probably meant that he was more surprised than any of them. I knew he was a little bit insane when he decided he liked you, but I didn't know he was a masochist too, he commented. Sakura shot him a sour look even as she tossed an extra towel over the mess that Mitarashi-san had made. I'm not disputing that the seal is a useful tool. For us the access to the sheer volume of chakra isn't something we have naturally. It's different for clans like the Uchiha and the Uzumaki. Despite the fact that it was Itaki and not Sasuke, and she trusted that he stood outside the long history of the Uchiha clan's long campaign for more power, she could feel her expression cooling. Itaki regarded her levelly, though she could see his hands tighten into fists. In your eyes, he asked softly, as a shinobi, am I strong or am I weak? You're uncontestably the strongest shinobi of our generation, Sakura replied cautiously. Then that should give you some perspective when I say that every time that I have encountered the man who calls himself Uchiha Madara, I have been entirely outmatched. I killed my entire clan, save Sasuke, not only for fear of their own ambitions, but also due to his machinations. I am not my brother. I will not blindly accept power without thought to the consequences. But neither am I willing to lose what little family I have left through stubborn pride. Better you than me, Mitarashi-san rasped. But you might need help beating that Madara's ass, so there's no reason not to, not when he's offering. I say take him in, Niji-san said. The Uchiha have always focused on overwhelming force and their specialized jutsu in their battle strategy. It would be useful if we could counter with equal force on our side. I've always been curious what sort of animal he'd turn out to be, Sai commented. Also, the crazy lady already made a mess and this is a dead person's apartment, so we won't have to clean anything up if things go badly. It's literally a seal that will allow you to track your boyfriend. If you could just isolate that aspect, you could market it, Kakashi-senpai added cheerfully. There are no downsides. Except maybe a goddess looking in, now and then, but they're probably doing that anyway. Way to make that sound weird instead of ominous, Niji-san muttered. I'm going to shower, eat something, and then not hunt down possibly the most infamous shinobi our village has ever unsuccessfully tried to kill several times before, Mitarashi-san said as she rose shakily from the chair. You kids have fun. Kill your heroes. You shouldn't treat it like a tool, to be handed out and taken back when a hunt is finished. The goddess's voice echoed as if from the walls of the shadowed hallway Sakura had been walking down. The seal is a divine gift and as such, binds their fate to yours. They will be your tribe, when you reach this side and take up your watch. Aside from these that you bound in ignorance, this one will make no more exceptions. If you wish to set them free, it is within your power, but if they die with the seal upon their body, they will follow you in 2 lives, not 1. My tribe. A ghost tribe, a short, bitter laugh escaped her. Ghost tribe. If nothing else, at least the name is something. If you're talking to me again, do you have anything to say about the one gnawing at the roots? Sons often resemble their fathers. Idealistic dreamers and jealous schemers can both branch from a single root. Sakura scowled, vaguely realizing she probably looked ridiculous, talking to herself in an empty hallway and making faces at something no one else could see. If you want me to be wary of something, if you want me to guard against something, to hunt something, it would be helpful if you were specific. This one will not open my eyes to see what he has become, was the unhelpful response. In the silence, she remembered Tsunade-sama's response to her description of their encounter. A shrine on what looks like the face of the moon. She'd said thoughtfully. Not that there aren't other possibilities, but, when I was little, my grandfather used to tell me stories about an evil goddess that the Sage of 6 Paths sealed away and then banished to the moon. Just be careful. Whatever that might look like, when you're dealing with that kind of power. Goddess or demoness, they can both wear a beautiful face, and either of them can kill you as easily as breathing. Sakura had never heard any such story, about an evil goddess sealed in the moon, but none of the stories handed down from her grandmother had said anything much about the Sage of Six Paths either. She'd had to ask Senpai afterward to even learn Atsutsuki Higoromo's name. Not that he'd known it. No one told me fables when I was little, he'd told her blandly over the edge of his book. But the Hyuga clan claims descent from some sage and they've been fighting about it with the Uchiha since they became two clans, and there's probably only so many sages going around founding major shinobi clans, so you could try asking the Hyuga you've possibly bound to an evil overlord. Niji-san had indeed heard of the Sage of Six Paths and even vaguely knew of the story about the sealing of an evil goddess, something about the unwillingness to share the gift of chakra with the world, which was only one of any number of heroic deeds that he'd carried out during a remarkable lifetime that was now largely forgotten. Aside from that, he knew his proper name, that he had been married to a princess of some kind, and that the Hyuga clan's propensity for bearing twin sons could be traced back to the sage, who'd essentially been the first god of shinobi. "Sorry that I can't remember more," he'd apologized gruffly, not making eye contact. "The people who told me the stories have been gone for a long time." So which was she, this spirit who'd used the breach in the barrier between the spirit and mortal realms to advance her own agenda? Goddess? Demoness? Maybe, Sakura thought as she considered how unlikely it was that they could simply be free of the seal, not when they needed its power and the spirit needed mortal hands to carry out her will. She can be both. And what did it mean, when she shared the Sage of Six Paths name? When Sakura, in describing the goddess or sharing her words, had been unable to say Atsutsuki Kagaya's own. Kill your heroes. If there was a way to go entirely without sleeping during their hunt for Tobi or Uchiha Madara or whomever he happened to really be, or at least one without catastrophic health consequences, Sakura would have taken it. As it was, the stress of keeping up pretenses in front an endlessly optimistic Naruto, Gaara who might have counted among her fellow shinobi but who was also a foreign dignitary, and Sasuke who was still himself, made her silent and irritable. The steady warmth of Senpai's back pressed against hers made it bearable. She grew accustomed to waking to Sai being almost cat close to her face. It was actually weird to have Itaka there as well, like two separate parts of her life were bleeding over into each other. The time they'd spent pretending to be other people as Tsunade-sama's shadow guard had been strange enough on its own that it hadn't seemed odd then, but having him at her side during a hunt that was Witch and Hound's domain, and it felt a little like he was intruding on it in a way that wasn't entirely welcome. She didn't like the dissonance, even if she was simultaneously glad to have him there. It helped that Uchiha Itaka was, above everything else, a consummate shinobi. If he was experiencing similar mixed feelings, he kept them flawlessly concealed, his expression settling into the same cold lines as the first time she'd met him on the battlefield in an Akatsuki cloak. She wondered just how much that expression masked. Sakura had lived with Kakashi-senpai long enough to know that not everyone dealt with things by talking them over with others, but he had done that by choice, surrounded by shinobi that remained as much friends as he'd let them be. Itaki had willingly given his up and lived in a silence he'd intended to carry down into his grave. Was she supposed to ask? Or was she supposed to respect the emotional space she'd have wanted in his place? Like most hunts, it was both fraught and boring. Given their target's abilities, it was possible, perhaps even probably, that he could be hunting them in turn, but so far Sakura had been given a lot of time to turn over rocks in her relationship with Itaki. He was not Tatsuo. Zen had not been Tatsuo, either, but then Zen had not been Uchiha Itaki. Having once had the kind of trust and understanding that came from building each other up from nothing and disaster, and very importantly standing very close to equal in power, she had formed an idea of what a relationship between two people should look like. When she had first met Itaki, he had been the most dangerous shinobi she had ever faced and, almost subconsciously since then, had holding herself back from giving Itaki the power to hurt her in ways that had nothing to do with knives. She still thought she had been very lucky to have had Tatsuo at all. But, perhaps, it had also been a kind of curse, because he had died before there were anything but halcyon days. It had been sweet and sure and certain in ways that the person she was now, would she have been able to hold on to that? Or was that a feeling that had only belonged to that Sakura, who was so far away from the woman she was today? Could she make herself stop clinging to that? Could she make a leap of faith? Was it that the person waiting to catch her was Itaki? Or was it something in her own heart and mind that kept her from reaching out? Would she end up like Kakashi-senpai? She wanted to cross the chasm. Itaka was all sorts of good things tangled together. He was calm in the face of her flash-fire anger and solid in his own opinion against the seething force of carried grievances. Kind and polite, he would never, ever embarrass her in public, and that wasn't just a mask that he took off in private. Once committed to something, he was dedicated beyond all reason, and there would be something powerful in taking all his firsts. More shallowly, he was even more beautiful than the brother she'd sacrificed so much to pursue, and marrying him would make her the matriarch of one of the most storied, infamous clans in Konohagakure. These weren't the things that she carried at the forefront of her mind when thinking about her commitment to him, but they did temper the way she considered the relationship and thus deserved to be acknowledged. This was not to say that he wasn't flawed, even in his strengths. That practiced politeness made it difficult to tell how much he whitewashed his real feelings, but she felt that was something she'd learn in time. She was also slightly worried about the Uchiha bloodline that flowed beneath his calm surface, that strange obsessive streak and the madness and the heavy loyalty that were all hallmarks of his family. It reached a point that the only thing that kept her from discussing her feelings with the man in question was fear of being thought the girl, someone who couldn't keep her feelings to herself during a mission. But one evening, watching Sasuke and Naruto nearly come to blows in the recurring crisis that had been Team 7, she realized that was an awful double standard. If she'd been clingy and slow to act, she'd also been the one to follow the protocols they'd taught them at the academy. She'd been judged herself for it, but then it had been the boys who were always bleeding rage and competition and unwarranted courage all over even straightforward missions. And she had been weak then. She'd needed that moment of self-realization. But they weren't the people they had been. Now it was Naruto who calmed himself and talked Sasuke down, before a single punch could be thrown or someone had to step in. Talking to Itaka, during what might be their last chance to have this conversation, wasn't going to compromise anything. This was, in its own way, courage. Besides, with the seal binding so many of them, and Team 7 tying in the others, it wasn't like these people were strangers. This was her family. In this life and, for some of them, the next. So she took Itaka as far aside as she dared, which wasn't far, drawing him down so that their knees were touching, bringing her fingers to interlock with his, but not interlace. He followed her lead willingly enough, but his expression showed faint bemusement, which was fair. She'd been all but ignoring whatever this was between them lately, but he didn't seem angry about that. "Sorry for doing this," Sakura murmured. "But there's a question I want to ask you. What do you want my love for you to look like? What do you see as our future together?" He regarded her steadily for so long that she thought he might need clarification, but before she could arrange her own thoughts to rephrase the question, he answered. "I want you to take me for granted," he said simply. It was Sakura's turn to stare at him in confusion. "What?" That made a faint smile tug at the corners of his lips. "I don't mean that I don't want you to never thank me again or acknowledge the things I do for you. What I mean is that I want you to expect me to be there for you. To allow yourself to be angry or sad or annoyed or anything else you're really feeling in front of me, because I want to be family, not polite strangers. To expect things of me, like we've been married for as long as anyone can remember and don't know any other way. I don't need or want the heights and lows of the kind of passion that burns and scars. There is sufficient danger and excitement in my life already. I'd rather have a steady, unwavering intimacy, one that can weather even you insisting that my brother is a catastrophe waiting to happen." "Well," Sakura warbled, voice slightly unsteady, "that's good, because that opinion isn't going away anytime soon." His smile was soft. I know that, when the manor house is rebuilt, Heitake-senpai will probably live with us. And that you'll tolerate my brother living with us like sharing space with an unfriendly cat. You'll probably spend more time with Heitake-senpai than with me, especially for the next several years as the village rebuilds itself once again. I hope that you'll be more famous than me, because I don't want to become an obstacle to your career. In turn, I hope that you won't mind if, once this mission is finished, if I find ways to build things up instead of destroy them. I've been thinking, perhaps, the orphans from the crush, if you don't mind, we might take some in? I know that you wanted to think about children, and I'm not so traditional as to think that you haven't built a family if you don't have any, but, I think it will feel like atonement. There isn't a lot to go around just now. It will be hard for families to take them in. Despite the anxiety and the weight of that particular idea, Sakura could squelch the flutter of amusement she felt. When you say, not so traditional, I think you're underestimating yourself. After all, your immediate dream for the future is to retire as a house husband. I have killed enough people for 10 lifetimes, was Itaka's soft reply. I have been very tired, for a very long time. The chance to make a comfortable home and solve small crises where no one's life is at stake sounds like a dream that I'm not ashamed of having. If I marry the head of the family, Sasuke has to defer to me as the matriarch, yes. Itaka eyed her narrowly, but his eyes were laughing. Yes. This might be strangely like coming full circle for him, then. You, raising the small disaster with patience and tolerance, and I'll be the sternly disapproving commander of the military police. Itaka's eyes widened slightly at that revelation. Go Dame-sama intends to reinstate the force? She's already offered you the position, I take it. She's already officially appointed me, Sakura replied wryly. Congratulations, Itaka told her warmly. I think it suits you. You think so? He hummed an affirmation. Though that means you'll be both nearer and busier than I thought you'd be. Sakura drew in a breath, feeling her pulse fluttering like she was getting ready for a fight, and asked, Itaka, won't you entrust the rest of your life to me? And, remembering what he'd asked, from here on in, please always be by my side. He leaned forward, briefly pressing his forehead against hers, before he drew back enough to kiss the edge of eyebrow at her temple and then the other, locking their fingers together properly as he did so. I thought about asking you to place me in your family register, if it came to this, he said. It would be a fitting for a new beginning. Spring, after a very long winter. Konohagaku law only stipulates that we share a last name, not that you need to take mine. It would leave the legacy of the Uchiha name for Sasuke to restore. Don't you dare, Sakura replied, the relief of having it all said making her giddy. I've wanted to be an Uchiha since I was still in the academy. I didn't have any idea what it meant then, but now, while we're taking on everything else, I think it's a name worth redeeming. And it isn't any more impossible than any of the things we've already done. I know, Itaka said, his smile making him look the youngest she'd ever seen him, creasing his eyes. I believe in you. Kill your heroes. Chapter 70. Gammon, Part 3. Only the unrelenting light in his eyes had made him look like a living thing when they'd encountered him in that tower in rain, his skin stretched tight over the hard bones of ambition. Now there were only hollows in a face bruised and swollen with death. It had been a neat removal that wouldn't have caused any trauma to the eyes themselves. While the theft of a jujutsu as fearsome as his had been was enough to make her palms clammy as she examined the body and considered grimly who had gotten control of it, Sakura was also concerned about something else. Naruto was hovering in the periphery, making faces as she systematically stripped and inspected the corpse. Sasuke was crouched across from her, watching her expressionlessly, and Gaara loomed awkwardly close at her shoulder, arms crossed and face set in stern lines. She was considering snapping at the Kaze cage that he was blocking her light, but every time the cutting words formed on her tongue she kept them caged behind her teeth. She knew it was mostly the fear pricling beneath her skin that would have made her quick to lash out, but she was mindful that what happened in the field today would be remembered in the political negotiations of tomorrow. Presuming that they survived today. He was alive when they took him. She clarified. If you want to call that alive, yes, Sasuke replied. It's been days. It's not surprising that he'd die of his wounds. He didn't, Sakura replied. At least not the ones you caused. What do you mean? Gaara rasped. If he'd bled out, there would be less bruising, she pointed out. It's possible he died of shock, but, I can't imagine it. That his heart would just stop beating, after all of that. Someone hummed thoughtfully at her shoulder. Nah. Nagato-chan wouldn't give up like that. But you broke his heart, so Tobi made it stop hurting when he reached in and took it out, Tobi is a good boy. Sakura's own heart almost stopped in that moment, but her body was in motion from the moment that she recognized the voice as a stranger's, her hands on Nagato's chest serving as a pivot as she swept her body around to get out from under his hands and led with her feet when she returned. The Akatsuki member known as Tobi giggled and vanished before her taloned toes could make impact, but Sakura let her momentum carry her to her feet, hands unsheathing her knives as soon as they no longer supported her weight. Tail lashing behind her, snarl full of edges, she would have stepped between and behind, but Kakashi-senpai held out a hand and she obediently stilled. "Sorry, Sakura-chan. Let senpai have a conversation with an old friend. You can go do some gardening." "That weed looks invasive and tenacious," he said, tilting his head toward where the ground was rupturing around the fleshy leaves that marked the emergence of the last known member of Akatsuki. He smiled at her then, eyes creasing into half-moons even as his silver hair crept down his shoulders and his tail gave a reassuring swish. "After all, we have lots of things to talk about. Don't we, Obito? Rin looked for you on the other side. I promised her that I'd look for you on this one. Looks like I didn't have to try very hard." The eyes that opened were heterochromatic. One burned Uchiha crimson and bloomed into the second stage, while the other was the familiar placid dark, as fathomless as ever. The man in the Akatsuki cloak flinched back and then stilled before he said in a hoarse voice at odds with the one he'd been using to speak, "You always ruin everything, Kakashi." "Probably," Kakashi-senpai sighed. In a movement jerky with anger, the swirling orange mask was ripped from the man's face and thrown to the ground. He might have been handsome in another setting, with fine features and thick black hair shorn short, but what was most arresting was his eyes. They were narrow with rage and one was blazing red and the other was rings of purple. "Everything you touch, everything that I could have fixed it, why couldn't you just—" He could seem to get the words past the anger that choked him. And then he bellowed, "I could have fixed everything." And vanished and reappeared behind Kakashi-senpai, and she would have kept watching if her own target wasn't now free of the earth and watching them with one golden eye set in the mushroom pale half of his face. And, alarmingly, the ominous purple rings of the Rinnegan looked out of the pitch-dark half. Sakura had read what reports there were on this member of the Akatsuki, had in fact seen him briefly in the past, but there was a sense of wrongness about him now that her senses were heightened by the seal. It wasn't only the enormous cilia-tipped blades that towered over his shoulders, though that was a large part of it, nor the reports that he ate people, could you even call that cannibalism, but also a vague but persistent intuition. Her battle strategy was not Naruto's, who'd taken 2 running steps forward in her peripheral vision without his sage aura active, but the blue chakra of his signature jutsu pooling in one palm. She just desperately wanted to finish this, so in the moment that Kakashi-senpai had stopped her forward charge, she had immediately diverted the natural chakra that she'd have used for her jutsu through the bonds that bound her team together. This hastened their own transformations, so by the time Zetsu's cloak cleared the ground, her ghost tribe resembled humans about as much as he did. She didn't look back to see, but by the strangled sounds that Sasuke was making, he found Itaka's form as dramatic as she had. Yatagarasu. The 8-span crow, the servant of the sun goddess. Sakura had only seen him fully manifested once, when the characters had first formed and they had tested the seal, but she smothered the impulse to look again. His fine hair had thickened and lengthened into something almost like feathers, making him strongly resemble the statue of Madara standing in the valley, the color of it matching the vast dark wings that unfolded from his back, his forearms and shins covered in scales like a great bird's, with lines of light forming a kind of corona about his head. Kakashi-senpai had laughed out loud when he'd first seen it and remarked that it was probably the least stealthy thing he had seen since Naruto's sage form. Her hand snapped forward and she followed the knife through folded space, hand closing around the front of Zetsu's cloak and yanking him clear of the earth even as the knife in her other hand was forced up through fabric and flesh beneath his ribcage. She wouldn't have been surprised if her knife had encountered armor, wouldn't have even been particularly surprised if he'd managed to dodge, as her main objective had been to get him off the ground, as she had zero desire to have a battle beneath the earth. When there was a sound and sensation not entirely unlike cutting through celery, however, she couldn't help but hesitate. Zetsu smiled down at her pityingly and every hair on her body prickled in foreboding. With a sound that was wet and awful and unlike anything she'd ever heard before and probably would never forget again, he began to tear apart, but those parts were still clinging to each other, ropes of unfinished human stuff stretched between dark and light. The fleshy pad on the white side withered and fell away as the yellow-eyed Zetsu fell to the ground as his own person and leaped like he'd snatch her out of the air like a cat catching a bird, and the dark Zetsu melted back into the earth. "Teiku!" Niji shouted, alarm in his voice, and she whipped her tail up out of easy reach and flickered to his side just in time to brace herself as Naruto's massive raise-non, and why wasn't that idiot already wreathed in the golden aura of his sage form, impacted, and she had to squint hard against the blowback and, crouching, shamelessly used her tail to brace her just as Neji had swept one of his wings forward to use as a shield. With his eyes, it was as if the barrier didn't exist, but while the winds howled, Sakura was all but blind. She almost thought what she saw when she could bear to open her eyes properly again was an illusion, because a loud, disruptive attack like Raise-non was almost like an invitation. She hadn't bothered, because while she had chakra to spare, it was a waste of focus against those eyes, but if it was a genjutsu, it was one she couldn't break. Like a grassland in the spring, as far as the eye could see, those green cilia were sprouting. Naruto was shouting at the Dark Zetsu, who had survived his attack. He was your ally. Why would you take his eyes? You guys didn't even try to save him. These eyes were always mine. I only loaned them out to allow others to cultivate them, but Nagato failed, so of course I took them back, the Dark Zetsu replied. Should I have forced him to live on blind and vanquished in a world where all his friends were dead and his dreams had turned to dust? You are unexpectedly cruel, Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto snarled, his chakra billowing red around him before it blazed golden and the black markings of his sage state formed. Meanwhile, Ghost Tribe had reformed around Sakura's position even as Sasuke turned an enormous tract of their surroundings into a sea of black flame. While it dealt with whatever was beneath those cilia, Sakura couldn't help but ask Itaka quietly, or as quietly as she could speak and still be heard over the howling roar of flames that were crowning upwards to swallow trees, how much will this technique spread? She didn't want Zetsu to survive, but she didn't particularly want to file a report taking responsibility for black fire sweeping over rural villages either. They had found Nagato's discarded body within a mile of one of the riverside settlements that supported the well-developed shipping infrastructure that buoyed the industry of this country. Whatever their activities outside its borders, it was true that the god of rain and his angel had stabilized the lives of the many civilians within this country's borders and allowed for a robust economy that could afford to undersell the services of its ninja. These people probably already thought that Konohana shinobi were a force of evil. She didn't want to have to agree with them. Before Itaka could answer, all that fire was gone as cleanly as pinching the wick of a candle. Tobi no, Kakashi-senpai had called him Obito, hadn't he, was radiating ominous chakra as he glared at Sasuke. Not the ordinary sort that accompanied murderous intent, but the visible and tangible haze of a Jinchuriki. Sakura could remember the red rage of that long-ago bridge in Wave. This was if someone had distilled it for potency while erasing the rampant emotions that had characterized her experiences with demon vessels. Sakura had seen all sorts of expressions behind the shield of indifferent humor that Kakashi-senpai hid behind, but she had never seen him wear such a look of open suffering. In public it was always simply fractures, glimpses of what might lurk beneath that were quickly glossed over, but it was as if he couldn't recover himself enough to erase the lines of betrayal from his face. Her impression of Uchiha Obito was official records shallow, though she understood enough to know that almost everything of the Kakashi-senpai she knew was the product of the way his first team had died. He had been a truly negligent sensei. If it weren't for lucky happenstance, Sakura would have probably died along the way or festered in her own uselessness for lack of direction, but he had also been at her side through war and death and the hard and soft days in between. She was more than willing to hate on Senpai's behalf, that this was also the man who had his hands deep in the scheme that had put Sasuke's family beneath a blade, and Itaka's hand on the hilt had made him willing to bind his soul to a seal bestowed by a goddess of uncertain intentions for fear that he wouldn't be strong enough to face him meant that his intentions were irrelevant to everything but understanding how to best put to bed this long tragedy. I'd say something like, "Please don't make me do this again, but I think it's a little late for that," Kakashi-senpai said softly. "But, why?" There was an awfully fraught moment that was remarkably silent in the sudden absence of the fire that had dominated the soundscape, but then Kakashi-senpai smiled, if you could call it that, and asked, "Why wouldn't you at least grow your hair out if you were going to be play acting as Uchiha Madara? It's like this and you're making jokes. I made the mistake of following someone's bad example when I was younger. Luckily, I'm older and wiser now and unlikely to decide to emulate old teammates and throw away everything I've ever protected to go off and play terrorist. So there's that." "I never threw everything away," Uchiha Obito shouted back. "I'm trying to protect everyone. Can't you see this is wrong? It's all wrong." Jinchuriki, they wouldn't exist if it weren't for those monsters that she made. It's just because you don't know. On one hand, there was this dramatic reunion, but while she listened to their discussion, her eyes were focused on the earth, or rather on the scorched black leaves that were erupting like lodgepole pine cones after the fire, the black peeling away like the shell of an egg to reveal white underneath. There were innumerable arms reaching up. They were crowded close as far as she could see, and there were thousands upon thousands of them, and heaving themselves up out of the earth, yellow eyes fixing on them with no sign of disorientation from their birth. And amongst them all, watching with the indifferent composure of a dark god, was the Dark Zetsu, whole again after the horrific splitting. He no longer wore a cowl of fleshy leaves soaring above his head. Instead, on the freshly formed side that was missing an eye, there was a single back-swept horn like a root tip emerging just before his hairline. Obito didn't seem to be bothered or surprised by any of this, because he didn't hesitate as he continued speaking to Kakashi-senpai as if an army hadn't just spawned around them. The Biju were created by Otsutsuki Kagaya outside of the natural order of the world. They are monsters that exist and cannot be destroyed because, even sealed away, her pernicious influence remains and throws the world into chaos. So why not use them? Gather them and use their power to build a bridge to the moon where she was sealed by the sage, slay her, and use the light of the moon to radiate order and peace to this world. Now she did take a moment to stare incredulously at Obito, because the whatever you considered Kagaya, the moon was Tsukuyomi's domain. Having seen the other side of death, gods which had never felt real to her in any substantial way were all of a sudden beings that had to be considered when doing things that might shake both this world and that one. It was all so surreal that the fear didn't seep into her bones at first, because her mind wanted to disbelieve all of this like a bad illusion. Even the crush had not prepared her to believe that this kind of power was something that people could possess. She still had the memory of the war against AIM, if you could call their brief slaughter that, bright in her mind, but they had fought as part of an army then. Now there were less of them than she had fingers against this unnatural horde that had been summoned up out of the earth. She could feel the fear filling her, until it was as if the fear were the living thing and it simply wore Sakura like a skin. The air she breathed seemed cold and the core of her burned against the creeping chill that began at her fingers and the crown of her head and swept across her body, and there was a strange quality to her vision that pulled everything into hyperfocus that made it hard to think outside herself. But she was more than the fear, more than the knowledge that she might die, because in this battle what would it matter? If they managed to kill this body, she would fight them against when they challenged the moon, because her soul was bound to guard Otsutsuki Kagaya's long rest. Besides, Itaka was here, and Kakashi-senpai, and her soul would scatter before she left them to fight alone. So her fingers twisted in a signal to her team, and that strange truce that had existed long enough for Obito to throw all the blame for all the wars that had been waged in the name of Biju on a woman that hadn't walked the world for millennia. It vanished like a spring thunderstorm. In a desert, Gaara's technique made him a demon. In this silty riverside plain, maybe he couldn't turn the world into a waking hell for his enemies, but just because he didn't shout like Naruto or Sasuke didn't make him less dangerous. She remembered the terror of him in her only formal exam. She hadn't misremembered, because he reacted with inhuman quickness and his sand was every iota as deadly as Sasuke's black fire. It swept forward like a storm front, and in its wake the Zetsu were left in mangled chunks that dripped with stringy, clear liquid not unlike a pulped aloe stem. Sakura saw this only in passing, as she was already trying to make her way toward the ominous dark Zetsu that she could glimpse as she cut down the weeds in her path. They felt strange beneath her blade, like they had no bones, and though they at a glance appeared to be unarmed, their fingers turned into long, twisted things that could tear and gouge. They didn't fight like people either, because people, even badly trained ones, left space for their teammates when they fought and instinctively attempted to avoid blades, but these were like those clones that Naruto spawned to overwhelm more skilled enemies. They packed in, reaching over the shoulders of their fellows, trying to bear her down just by sheer numbers, and, because they did not die like people either, whatever clear ooze filled their veins, it seeped instead of gushing, and they did not have organs or arteries where her knives were accustomed to finding them, and when she slipped one of her knives into its sheath and delivered a crushing blow with her fist instead, it burst like a melon. Only where her fist went through, that liquid clung and burned like acid. Her gloves were untouched, but her skin peeled away and there was raw flesh and then bone, and Sakura tried to catch her breath through the sudden pain of it, instinctively drawing her hand close to her chest and shoving healing chakra at it without glancing down again. She made the decision to retreat toward Sai to give herself a little time and space to rethink her strategy. None of them had shifted very far from the others, but every foot was hard fought as Zetsu swept around them like the tide. Sai had created a fortress for himself using the thick coiled bodies of 4 8-headed snakes that were wreaking havoc even as other creatures spilled up and over the coils. An entire plague of rats the size of large dogs had begun to tear at the enemy with their clever, quick teeth. In other battles, he would have been safer in the sky, but in this one it was probably less dangerous to take one's chances with the Zetsu horde. The battle taking place above their heads looked like gods clashing. She vaulted over the back of an inky tiger, ignoring the way the sky darkened in the illusionary side effect of 4 Sharingan wielders summoning those monolithic chakra forms to clash like titans above their heads, and she hissed as an enormous sword of chakra swept in front of her, leaving a narrow chasm many times deeper than she was tall. It hadn't even been aimed at her, was instead Obito's recovery after catching Sasuke's sword blow. Sakura sent a silent apology into the world for the civilians who were probably cowering in their homes and businesses from the unimaginable noise of it, or watching dumbstruck out their windows, praying to gods they usually forgot to pass unharmed through this crisis. She heard Niji snarl something unflattering as he used his footwork to avoid it, dozens of Zetsu losing their human form as he mangled their chakra system as he passed, his golden wings tucked tight against his body for much the same reason she hadn't bothered to skywalk. Both of their weapons were best suited for close combat. He saw her retreat and angled himself so that they encountered each other at the Orokai formation. They fought their way there. Gaara walked. If he'd had the 9 tails sealed inside of him instead of the Ichibai, it wouldn't have even been a fight back then, Niji remarked tightly as they watched the Kazekiges approach. Sakura didn't bother to respond, knowing he could see her expression of agreement even as she tested the recovery of her hand. Her hand shook a little, but she no longer felt like throwing up when she jostled it, so there was that. All genjutsu were at their root one genjutsu, so it stood to reason that if one knew the shape of an element in one form, one could shape that element at will in all its forms. She reminded herself that she had never lacked control or theory, only the will and chakra to make something of it. Kakashi-senpai often teased her that her elemental type was metal, because she found the 4 elements equally as easy to use and all grossly chakra-draining compared to the sleek efficiency of her own style. There had been other concerns since her seal had become active, and it was usually more useful to take someone quietly and without collateral damage than breathe fire, and it was probably a very bad idea to attempt this sort of thing when besieged, but right now she was more liability than asset. So she had little to lose as she curled her empty hand loosely, like she intended to throw a ball. Her long, slightly curved nail gleamed like opals against the red of her raw skin, and she had a moment of disbelief that this could work, because for years she'd never gained strength or abilities that she hadn't bled for, but she looked at the blood smeared across her regenerating skin and told herself that this too had been bought with the suffering of her flesh. 5 auspicious claws, she called it as she drew her arm back like she was intending to crush someone with her chakra-enhanced strength, spreading her fingers wide as she transformed raw natural chakra to a wind that was all cutting edges. She slashed her hand forward before she could really begin to doubt herself, and was quicker and more vicious for her anxiety. It did not twist and whirl like a whirlpool, like Naruto's, and there was only the faintest gleam of blue to mark its presence, like heat haze, but it was as if she'd pulled razor wire taut and used it to cut firm tofu. If they had been real humans, ones that bled and screamed and begged, the carnage would have been awful. As it was, there were suddenly a great many white bodies oozing that sap stuff into the earth, and Gaara was giving her that same look he'd given her after the Chunin exam. The single Rinnegan eye of the Dark Zetsu dipped down from where he'd been watching the battle above them, but only briefly, and then he was ignoring them again. Gaara, as if in response to both Sakura and the Dark Zetsu, raised his hand and then closed it, and every rock and stone that she could see crumbled into sand. Beyond the reach of Sakura's shearing winds, Zetsu met their end. "Fine, make it a competition," Niji muttered, shifting into a familiar stance, and the ground beneath their feet began to glow in concentric circles whose rings were filled with esoteric hexagrams. Sakura was close enough to hear him take a settling breath before, 64 hexagram, 12 wings judgment. The array pulsed with enough force she felt it in her teeth, and the glowing Taijutsu beneath his feet swelled enormously for an instant, and in that instant, 6 clones of himself appeared at the points of a hexagram, and each of them spun like he would if he was using the 8 trigrams palm movement. But it wasn't only his hands that struck from his golden wings. Feathers flew with the same unerring accuracy and ability to close Tenketsu. She didn't have the wherewithal to count how many he struck, but hundreds of Zetsu fell as he landed lightly on his feet beside her again. He looked slightly sick and was breathing heavily. She also found the experience of assimilating clone memories disorienting and disconcerting. Not everyone was like Naruto, but she was entertained by the idea that Neji had learned about more than just her erstwhile teammate's dogma when he'd fought him in the exams. An erratic movement from one of the rats caught her eye. It sat up on its haunches and applauded their efforts. If you have time to be sarcastic, you have time to kill things. Sakura retorted playfully as she sprang forward with renewed energy, ignoring the jaunty salute that the rat gave with its tail. Her knife led the way and she caught up with it as it buried itself solidly in a broad white chest, both feet impacting against it as one had grasped the knife, and she swept her other arm between herself and the face that was growing root-like, wriggling teeth, fingers naturally forming hooked claws, and cut off 100 heads with one fell swipe. As the body began to fall backwards, she used it as a platform to launch herself back into the air, aiming her knife at Zetsu on the edge of her killing ground, and caught him in the eye. The force of it flung his head back and she landed with her feet on his shoulders and cut down ranks of the things, now within a step of the dark Zetsu. Or she was. As her knife opened the way, he was gone and suddenly emerged at Gaara's side. The Kaze cage had been following her with less speed but far more crushed bodies in his wake, all that sand that had recently been stone rampaging under his control. Sakura tensed. All of Ghost Tribe carried her chakra in their veins and one of her knives on their person, and Gaara had an anchor with him as well, but she didn't know how well she'd be able to watch over him when the white Zetsu reached him again. She couldn't really make a judgment before he had a chance to engage. His jutsu might end this quickly and his sand shield defense made him more invulnerable than Ghost Tribe's seal regeneration, but the only pleasant surprise Akatsuki had offered had been Itaki, and the others had been doing their best to make him seem even better by comparison. His sand roared toward the dark Zetsu like a plague of hungry locusts as Zetsu stretched out his hand, but it only tore away the dark flesh to reveal wood beneath, and it stopped pretending to be a human hand as it caught the Kaze cage up by the throat. Gaara snarled down at him even as his sand shield began to crack from the enormous pressure, long red hair falling into his eyes as his hands swept wide and then crashed toward each other, covering the whole tableau with a sandstorm. Sakura hesitated, because even if her skin could regenerate, she did not want to discover if she could still breathe with her lungs full of sand. The instant the sand began to fall away, she substituted herself with one of the fallen bodies, coming up just beneath the elbow of the arm that Zetsu was using to hold Gaara aloft. His skin was purpling, and much of his armor was gone in favor of preventing his assailant from crushing his throat, but he was alive. Sakura's black knife felt like it was meeting metal, but she struck again, harder, and her blade struck true and shattered. She watched the falling pieces with a sick feeling crawling up her throat. Sand tried to surge at her ankles, but it wasn't just that Gaara was suffocating. As her eyes flicked down for an instant, she saw the strange way it moved, like it was straining to break free of the sludge that entrapped it. Blood was largely water. The stuff that made up the insides of Zetsu were surely mostly water too. She didn't let herself think too hard. Gaara did not have time for her doubts and, keeping her eyes on the Zetsu who was regrowing skin in a human shade and who had a hand free, she slid her stance wide to touch one hand to the ground. The sheer number of bodies on the field of battle, all with identical chakra, had mudded her ability to perceive the subtleties of it, but with her hand deliberately in contact and it hurt, like touching scalding metal. She could sense that when they had crushed the white Zetsu, the chakra hadn't dissipated into the environment or even returned to the dark one. Instead, the liquid was almost more chakra than it was anything else, and with that understanding, she twisted her hand like she was unscrewing the lid of a particular difficult jar. Her chakra burst from her with the force of an explosion as she ripped control of the little liquid that existed within the chakra from Zetsu, sending it safely past the boots of her teammates before she gave it a tremendous mental shove. It splashed up and froze like the petals of an enormous flower, glistening with all the colors of the light emanating from the chakra constructs above. Gaara's sand swirled up to aid him, forcing itself grain by grain underneath Zetsu's hand. His fingers grew in an attempt to keep the Kaze cage entrapped, but Gaara blinked once and his hand closed over an empty shell of sand. Distracted and barely conscious, Gaara hadn't managed to substitute himself at any great distance, but he was free and Sakura was at his side, hands coming to touch his shoulder, and they would have retreated to the safety of size 8-headed snakes, but when she tried to use the Hiraishin again, something gave a mighty yank on the hand that had been so badly burned. It like being jerked back out of a doorway. One was almost through. She wasn't braced for it and lost her balance, but as she was falling she put her foot against Gaara's back and kicked him away as gently as she could manage and still get him far enough from Zetsu that Sai's creations could retrieve him in relative safety. She could feel it now, the thing that had burned her, spreading thready roots up her arm and trying to do something, and it felt like fire ants crawling up her veins, biting and there was no getting them off. It was only when the loam dark soil was rising up around her like a cavernous mouth, cilia framing the slice of sky that held the battle of Sheri-non above, that she recognized she had underestimated just how thoroughly saturated this environment was with Zetsu's chakra. He spoke directly to her for the first time. If we had collected the power of the 10 tails in time, it would not have come to this. But the gods are smiling on me. 6 sages brought themselves to forge one path that she cannot ignore. For the peace and order of the world, surrender, Deva. The other paths will follow you soon enough. Those hateful pale eyes, I see the Azura path charging this way. Then the world was dark and burning. Kill your heroes. Chapter 71. Gammon, Part 4. She'd had nightmares like this after the bridge. Sometimes it had been her burning, instead of that man. By the time she'd met Gozen-san, she'd had them more rarely, but the old woman had made certain she knew with excruciating clarity exactly what fire felt like. This was something worse than fire that was often deceptive in the sheer trauma that could appear minutes or hours after encounters where the victim was never touched by visible flames. It could even create a kind of giddy delirium, where someone could feel no pain at all and pass on convinced that they were fine and all would be well. Even if you felt pain, there was only so much the mind was willing to endure before shock took you and the soul left the body to whatever end. That was what made genjutsu so dangerous. Sakura's could convince the mind the body was in so much suffering that she could kill without ever touching a person. The Sheri-non could trap the mind in a cycle that shock could not interrupt until the jutsu was finished. Sakura had never been trapped in Tsukuyomi, but she thought this might be like that. Or at least she thought that in fragments around the sensations that were everything she might have been screaming, if only she hadn't gasped from the sudden pain and her muscles locked like there was some sort of neurotoxin present in the mix of acids that were trying to dissolve her into something. Bones, maybe, and maybe she'd felt grimly blasé about the possibility of death before the battle, but when faced with it Shinataku now. Not like this. Not when the things she'd been living for all this time were almost in her hands. Zetsu could try to eat her, but maybe she would eat him first. Gozen-san had warned her to never block out her own pain with genjutsu, that having done it once, she would do it again and again and again until she couldn't bear even minor pain without it. So she tried to gather the shreds of herself and turn her mind inward, away from the physical pain, and she sort of managed, though she just about lost herself to it when her visualization of her interior landscape showed her chakra pathways like choked rivers being invaded by mangrove roots. The sea where the pearl rested in her danshin was still free of Zetsu's influence, and she curled herself around it like her consciousness could become the walls of a city to defend against siege. She set the pearl to spinning, drawing in natural chakra with more speed and force than she'd done since the early experimental days of laying in the seal. How much water does it take to make a sea overflow? Sakura was more than willing to discover the answer. Even if it hurt. What was a little more pain, after all, when she was already awash with it and there was no sign that she could even lose consciousness under this technique? She didn't know whether that was on purpose or if, as prey, she was a little hard to chew. It was entirely possible to rupture one's own chakra channels due to an unregulated influx of natural chakra, which was what the seal of the false sage was designed to avoid, but after manipulation of the seal by its Satsuki Kagaya, their seal caused the regeneration normally only observed in the Jinchuriki. Sakura was gambling everything on this one thing. If she could pull in enough power, the seal would create even as it destroyed. She had to fight to do it. Her body was receiving so much trauma that chakra was continually flowing out to keep her alive, but with a roar that made her jaw ligaments tear, chakra began to flood in like she'd opened up a pit at the bottom of that sea, and all the rivers that fed it had to feed its endless hunger. Something seemed to split between her eyes, and suddenly all of this wasn't only something she visualized in her inner landscape. Chakra became something that she could see, and everything was limned in light of varying strengths and colors. She had enough strength and freedom to be violently sick now, her knees giving way as she vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach, sweat, and something sour-smelling sizzling as it evaporated off her skin. The bones in her forearms snapped where they were supporting her weight, and now she did scream, because it felt like her bones, or maybe the marrow in them, had become a living thing that was trying to force its way out. Sakura lost time then, probably not for the first time, but this was the first time that she recognized it and came back to herself with a singular thought that had to be wrong, had to be the result of being sick and disoriented, lying almost in her own vomit. She rose shakily to her knees, head hanging, looking dumbly down at the objects that were suffused with opalescent chakra. Her hands shook as they closed over the hilts of the two swords born of dragon bone and suffering and the chakra that bound all things, but her physical strength was returning swiftly and she shoved herself the rest of the way to her feet with a grim determination. She couldn't truly see how they looked without physical light, it wasn't that kind of sight, but she could see the shape of them and they were longer than her knives had been. Head turning toward where chakra wrought green was knotted tightly outside the earth that trapped her, she prepared to breach the barrier and had to squint against the sudden influx of light that flooded in as it crumbled away. It was Gaara, face pale with effort and streaked with sweat, breathing heavily, who let his hands fall. It had not occurred to Sakura, not even when her thoughts were at her most desperate and disjointed, to hope for someone to come for her before she either saved herself or didn't. There was a sober kind of energy that usually surrounded the Kaze Kage the few times she'd met him as an adult, a composed kind of reserve that was difficult to break, but she was most struck by him now, the most alive and present she'd ever seen him. He'd grown out his hair in the intervening years, the bottom part worn loose to his collarbones, most of the upper part in a doubled-over tail that gave off a vaguely samurai impression, and side-swept bangs that framed his vivid tattoo. His eyes took her in from her antler tips to her toes and his relieved smile seemed to shift his whole aspect for a moment before he ducked his head and his focus and hers returned to Zetsu. He looked almost like a person now, if you ignored the way his hands looked as if they were the nightmare claws of the guardian spirit of some sacred tree, and the thorn-like horns that jutted up just in front of his hairline. Niji was engaging him as Sai kept the white Zetsu army at bay, the Hyuga's hands moving with the deftness of a musician, but far more swiftly than any civilian could even follow with their eyes. It was clear with her new vision that he could harry his enemy successfully, but he couldn't permanently seal the Tenketsu and it was only a matter of time before he tired. Sakura flashed to his side, fresh fangs bared, and for a moment thought they could turn the tide. That was before Zetsu caught sight of her. And before she properly focused on him. That third eye, are you watching through it? He demanded of her. Or rather, of the goddess behind the seal. I knew that this shallow and chaotic world you left as your legacy wouldn't produce 6 sages at the same time in any circumstance except one you arranged. Are you fearful? Are you guilty? You should be. This is your fault, he breathed even as he swept aside Niji's seeking hands. Sakura settled into a ready stance just out of the way of their fight, waiting until she caught the rhythm of Niji's beautiful dance before she risked breaking it. She knew enough of gentle fist style from her days as Tatsuo's partner to know it wasn't about force so much as it was about flow. Fighting at someone's side was about more than just charging in whenever you could get up again. It was also about understanding and trust. And perhaps, if you were arrayed against a single opponent that wanted to talk while exchanging blows, waging some psychological warfare without getting in the way. So she retorted, why would she be watching? She can't even stand to look at you. Zetsu's brows dipped down in rage and he yanked the earth from underneath their feet, causing Niji to instinctively snap open his wings rather than fall. Sakura darted in when Zetsu would have rushed forward to take advantage of that split second of air resistance, and this time her blade did not shatter, it sheared through his arm at the elbow like a sheet of steel thrown by a hurricane cut through a sapling. She pushed her advantage as his arm fell away, and for a moment thought she had a chance even as thick, muscle-like roots began to sprout from the stub. She was at something of a conventional movement disadvantage, because there was nothing to substitute herself with suspended in the air as they were in her swords, while they could serve as anchors, weren't balanced, or shaped in such a way as to fly true when thrown. There was a slight curve to them, like the bones they were born of. But when skywalking, anywhere she willed could be solid ground at any angle she wished, and she launched herself up past his shoulder, pulled her legs in and twisting her body and finding footing standing with her face looking down to the earth. She launched herself at him, but found herself evaded when she would have cleaved off his head, so she manipulated the air and kicked off of it, sending her blades scything toward him. He deflected them with the flat of his hand, never letting the biting edge of the blade break his skin, using the same principle as the gentle fist style, using softness to overcome hardness. She and the swords were learning each other in this battle, and she would have made each cut cleaner, more efficient, more deadly if she had not heard, and that word was insufficient to describe the way it resonated in her senses, a wet gurgle that made her look down. The earth had only sunk perhaps a foot or two, and that was little enough that on the upsweep of his wings, Niji's feet had briefly touched the ground. The arm that she'd severed had taken root in that chakra-soaked soil and had first caught his foot, grown up his body, and then run him through the ribcage with 5 spear-like tips. The whole growth looked almost like a hand, and it seemed to squeeze even as it pushed deeper into his organs. His lips were already flecked with white foam. She was at his side with a thought, severing the whole thing from its root. Her hands released the swords they held, and the swords fell for only a moment before it shivered and vanished, becoming vivid tattoos that looked not at all like swords along her forearms, and one pressed against his clammy skin even as the other closed over the growths. Sakura was depending on her ability to feed him chakra if he couldn't muster enough to regenerate on his own. If that failed, well, she wasn't a medic, not really, not in the sense of being a properly trained field medic, and maybe she could stabilize him for some short period, but in a battle like this where it was all attrition thus far, she doubted she could save him. She tried to scald the roots out of him like she'd done for herself, and she could feel him struggling to help her, but while she'd trained with this kind of chakra manipulation during the period when Sai and she had been applying the layers of the first seal, Niji and the rest of Ghost Tribe experienced it more like becoming Jinchuriki to a voiceless demon and less like becoming something like a real sage. Even as she forced chakra into the connection between them, she could feel his life force fluttering as the roots inside him began to eat at the chakra keeping him alive. She began yanking them out physically and had to almost crush him to her, a one-armed hug to keep him from thrashing as she did so. They were crouched on a thin, solid layer of her chakra in the air, his back braced against the inside of her knee. Gaara and Sai were covering them as Zetsu tried to slaughter his way through ink and sand. Sai had made use of his experience fighting the Angel of Aim and concealed his ink inside Gaara's attacks, allowing him to attempt attacks from unexpected angles, but they were having as much trouble as she had with her knives. She had already torn several of the roots free when she felt Niji's life force begin to dim alarmingly, and she made a split-second decision to take the same risk with his life as she had made with her own. His control, the control of all of Ghost Tribe, was extraordinary, and she really believed that he could survive the infusion. Laying him out, she placed one palm over his danshin and the other on his forehead and began to pull chakra actively from the world again, until it was winding around her body in thick white currents that swirled around her arms and dove into the chakra system beneath her hands that had already been invaded by that wrought green chakra. It became a battle between the two invading forces, and she was so occupied in watching for signs that the magnesium fire flare of her own chakra wasn't damaging Niji that she missed the moment where a lively and living green joined her own. It was only when she noticed the roots shriveling that she noticed the chakra, and by then it was already too late to make any decisions about it. The body under hands shifting like Niji was drawing a deep breath, but it wasn't Niji beneath her hands any longer. The man that was looking up at her from beneath heavily lashed lids had the same pale eyes, but the shape of his face was subtly different. It reminded her of Gaara's in the shape of the jaw, though perhaps it was the heavy kohl or tattooing around his eyes that made her immediately call the Kaze cage to mind. He had horns at his hairline like Zetsu's, except his were a little longer and jutted forward slightly before tipping back. His hair was long and his skin exactly the same shade as that which Zetsu had regrown after they'd stripped away that dark flesh. Sakura eased back cautiously as he sat up, uncertain as to whether to attempt anything with the way his chakra had coated Niji's own. He must have read the worry on her face, for he said, "Don't worry. I won't cause my vessel any harm. I will return him to you fully recovered from my brother's chakra." "Brother?" Sakura asked, rising when he did, tail whipping slightly in agitation. "Hagi Oromo. The one you're battling, the one whose chakra was eating your companion alive." Sakura looked at him dumbly for a moment. "Atsutsuki Hagi Oromo? The Sage of Six Paths? That shouldn't be right. You didn't know?" "No, I thought I knew, or I thought I knew that he was the one that Kaguya was referring to when she was making cryptic references to, the one gnawing at the roots of the tree, but, why what?" He had a serious and very stern look, this stranger, but he seemed to soften a bit at this, though he did not properly smile. Kaguya-sama was once better at explaining things, but her long solitude and the events that preceded it have made her very unwilling to interact with others. "I look in on her from time to time, but she is always asleep. I will be brief, so that we can rejoin your companions, but you ought to know what you are fighting. If Kaguya-sama told you nothing when she touched her hand to your fate, he said, his words quick but clear, "and what you are fighting for." "I am Atsutsuki Hamura, and once, a very long time ago for mortals, Atsutsuki Kaguya was my sister-in-law in a land at war. She was a brilliant strategist and tactician who wanted more than anything to bring the fighting to an end. War has always thinned the veil between worlds, and this was such a war that there was a tree rooted in both worlds that grew a very magical fruit you today call the energy. It contained chakra, but in my age it was a power only gods and spirits had access to. Kaguya-sama was a person of restless energy and often took long walks in strange places to clear her mind so that she could face the next battle with the kind of detached clarity that makes truly good generals, and it was in one of these walks that she discovered the tree. She ate of the fruit, even the seeds, and the power came to dwell within her. She was already powerful in mind, but this power gave her physical strength that made her stronger than any normal human and gave her eyes that could see the energy of things." He made a gesture toward his own eyes at this. "It was too strong, and she too unpracticed, to be entirely contained within her body. Eventually it would spread to all the known world, but on that first night after she ate of the fruit, my brother's intimate contact with this human goddess gave him power of his own power subtly unlike hers. She turned hers to the battlefield for the good of the people, and he turned his to his own cultivation. While she was pacifying the world, he grew in knowledge and power and dissatisfaction. His power was not enough. So he sought out the tree that had borne the fruit and ate the roots, like they were ginseng or some other miraculous medicinal herb. His eyes changed then, growing those rings like the rings of a tree, and his power became deep-rooted and overwhelming, but he still remained intent only on his own path and the path of his sons, who he took with him into seclusion when he emerged from his first closed-door practice and found them old enough. Perhaps he meant to accrue enough power to put an end to all the fighting all at once, without the kind of tedious, grinding work that Kaguya-sama exerted to bring about her peace. But somewhere along the way, he began to go astray. By the time my nephews were adults competing with each other to the point of killing, despite having been raised almost exclusively under his tutelage, he was once again unsatisfied by his own power and the transient nature of peace. He began first to merely blame her, and then he entirely turned against her. 1,000 years after what transpired on that dark day, Tsukiyomi-sama granted me an audience and told me what he knew of what happened. Kaguya-sama was already nearly to the point of ascension, her time in the mortal world almost at its end, when Hagoromo tried to take her power as his own. Despite the fact that he had become almost a stranger to both of us, this broke her heart and broke her strongest bond on this realm. She retreated from it, beginning her long and bitter self-exile in the white silence of Tsukiyomi-sama's empty plains, and he told the people that he had sealed a demon that would have stolen their power if it had remained. People had always been quick to think the worst of her, Hamura murmured, a distant look in his eyes. They believed him. Even though she had given them the very thing they were so proud of, she was reviled as a monster and he became a hero for the ages. Shall we remind him of the real history of the world? He asked. This was all revealed so quickly that Sakura had little time or emotional space that wasn't occupied with the anxious need to return to her teammates to react to the revelation. It was enough for her. It seemed as if this Hamura, like Kaguya, intended to help them. It wasn't as if she could verify any of it in any case. But if she had to serve a goddess for the rest of this incarnation, she'd as soon believe her to be a good one. Clasping her hands around her elbows and dragging them down the length of her forearm, Sakura unsheathed her swords and flashed back to Zi-no, Hagoromo's side as an answer. Kill your heroes. Chapter 72. Gammon, Part V. She used Sai, who'd unintentionally become her closest anchor as the battlefield had shifted around his scaled fortress, to flash closer before she actually had to flicker toward Hagoromo. Sai had been strangely stationary this entire battle, even considering the thundering clash of titanic forces above their heads, but she hadn't given it a lot of thought. The moment that she landed next to him and he blinked up at her with the distinctly not guilty look of a cat caught doing something it knew better than to try, she knew that it had been intentional. It only took a glance to understand what he had done. They say there's a type of salamander that lives in this country that can regrow its limbs, she said with no little exasperation. Since you decided to try this on a battlefield, you have no right to complain if I call you salamander for the rest of your natural life. All the books say that nicknames are signs of familiarity and affection, Hag, he said, grimacing as she thumped him gently upside the head with the hilt of a sword. She hadn't hit him hard, it was less the impact of that and more so the jolt of chakra she sent surging through him, the inky black blood that had been seeping from the open veins and arteries of his partially regrown leg quickening its solidification into living flesh. He'd been sitting on several enormous scrolls and had been using his own blood, fraught with chakra, to summon the great waves of creatures he'd been summoning throughout the battle. In Sai's strange little worldview, this had probably counted as killing two birds with one stone. She didn't stay to watch his toes form, she had an ancient sage to overwhelm. Despite her brief delay, she didn't arrive too long after Hamuragara had made the way impassable with a construct more complicated than his usual techniques. It was some sort of beast that looked like no animal that had ever lived but resembled many of them in part, scorpion, an ant and lizard, that had Hagoromo trapped in its many barbed mandibles, which were like some awful marriage of swords and fishhooks. She wondered briefly if it was something born out of the stories passed down from the time the people of Suna were wanderers of the desert. Gaara hadn't chosen to make his beast gargantuan, like those clashing above them, and so she could still see Hagoromo impaled and dripping the liquid that wasn't blood. Sakura wouldn't have chosen to fight like the Uchiha did even if it was within her power. The more obscured one's vision was, such as when fighting within monstrous constructs, the easier it was for the enemy to carry out subterfuge. She liked her enemies in her sight and within her reach. So she silently admired his technique even as she distrusted Hagoromo's apparent defeat. She was not disappointed in that sense. Even as she darted forward, intending to tear through that knot of chakra at his core with her own fangs, it unspooled until it was like looking into the sun. When she could see again, there was a tree and it blossomed as it devoured the chakra in Gaara's construct, the buds falling away as the limbs began to be weighed down by fruit. They were a stone fruit, like peaches. She only knew this because they burst when they fell from the tree, oozing juice from the pale flesh around the pitch-black core. The trunk split with a sound like the crack of lightning striking a tree and Hagoromo walked out, whole and hale, and this whole process took only heartbeats. "Hello, brother," Hamura greeted, hands relaxed at his side, like he hadn't just seen someone regenerate themselves from a tree. But then again, he was an ancestral spirit riding a living body of his line, so perhaps he had seen stranger things in his time. By contrast, Hagoromo wasn't relaxed at all. His face instantly creased with lines of fury, more raw and honest than that mask he'd worn as Zetsu or even the controlled zealotry that had shadowed his real face. "You," he said, turning the word into a pejorative. "You're dead." "Yes," Hamura acknowledged calmly. "That's the usual cycle for mortals. Even ones who don't have brothers who send them on their way," he said with gentle mockery. This served only to enrage Hagoromo further and he rushed toward his brother, whip-like roots groaning and reaching as they burst from the ground around the tree, but the difference between Hamura's skill and Niji's was obvious. Not quite a chasm, but certainly a clearly observable gap, especially with her third eye open. His hands didn't merely close Tenketsu, like Niji's, but left behind a hook of his own chakra so that the point couldn't be forced open by raw strength. He also had the advantage of who knows how many years of experience compounded by a body at its peak. It was a thing of cruel beauty to watch him move and counter the enemy that had thus far been fighting with them like a jounin sparring with genin. Against any other enemy, he would have had them as helpless as a civilian in seconds, but Sakura could see that Hagoromo's chakra was already beginning to eat at the remnants of Hamura's. She had overcome an enemy far more powerful than her by leaving him between, once, and she considered bitterly if that would work on Hagoromo or if he'd just sprout anew like a coppice tree. If Hamura failed to subdue his brother, that would be her next strategy. She just doubted it could be accomplished as neatly as she'd managed last time. Maybe she would have to stay between with him. Bind him somehow. She knew there were seals for it, but she didn't know them. No one had ever taught her anything broadly and systematically since the academy, and she sharply felt the regret of it now. She absolutely did not want to die, did not want even more to stay in that void world until something in that black world devoured them both, or she went mad, or her soul scattered and returned entirely to the universe, she supposed. But if she knew a way, she would do it. She would. She tasted blood and realized she'd bitten through her lip entirely in frustration, because she couldn't. She had no way to guarantee she could trap Hagoromo between worlds, and if she couldn't do that, she would have sacrificed herself for nothing and she'd drown in the bitterness before anything could destroy what was left of her. While these thoughts roiled silently through her, the brothers confronted each other. You dare to mock me, when you were the one who betrayed me? Hagoromo snarled. I pretended to be blind when you first developed those eyes, even though the whole clan was guessing at what you had done to earn such favor, especially when you had already refused to remarry when your wife died in childbirth, but then you began to defer to her public and even sided with her against me. We were full-blood brothers, Hamura. The water of the covenant is thicker than the blood of the womb, Hamura replied, his long hair swaying as he ducked the long spears that would have driven themselves through his eyes. I might have been your brother, but I believed in Kaguya-sama's vision and, once, you did too. I swore to serve Kaguya-sama as my liege lord and you were trying to kill her. You were the one who made me choose between you. It would not have come to that, if only she had submitted to me and surrendered the power she was never supposed to have. Order in the world begins in the family. If a woman speaks first, disaster follows. Anyone who suffered under that demon she left behind could testify to that. Kaguya-sama was not in a clear state of mind when she left the Ten Tails to guard my body and my legacy when she left this world, and anyone who can calmly accept that their spouse in a marriage of more than respect and obligation is trying to kill them is not human, but it was you drove it mad in your attempts to either kill or assimilate it. It was you who tore it into 9 separate beasts who had forgotten their purpose. Those things are not her fault. How would you know? You were dead by your hand. Hamura said coldly. If you think the dead are unaware of the doings of the living, why would anyone ask them for guidance and protection? It took you more than the days it took for me to cross the river to the spirit realm to destroy her legacy. This drew a bitter laugh from Hagoromo. I see you still have an answer for everything. And are still blindly devoted to her, after all this time. If you had spent a fraction of the time you spent developing your ninja at your wife's side, you would understand. I never envied you anything but her, but we also never betrayed you in the way that you seem to think. She was devoted to all of her causes and you were one of them. Kaguya-sama was someone with whom I shared laughter and tears and more. We lived together, learned together, fought together. While you were in seclusion, I was at her side, on battlefields waged both with weapons and with words. She helped me raise my children even as you made it so that her own sons were almost strangers to her. I saw her mistakes and I saw how hard she worked to make them right again. I was with her until the end and I am with her still. Even when you had betrayed everything between the two of you, and she turned her back on the world, she did not forget to protect the nephews to whom she was the only mother they had ever known. The Hyuga clan exists today because of the decisions she made in the last seconds of her mortal life. What I owe her can't be expressed in words, but it's about more than owing. She was my friend, Hagoromo. I wonder if you can even understand what that means. Hagoromo snarled wordlessly at his brother before he seemed to recover himself, expression closing off as he forcefully recovered from his surprise, but in that moment where he was focused on his internal turmoil rather than exclusively on the battle environment, Sakura struck. Maybe she couldn't bind him there, but Hagoromo was fearless in the way he fought. He was fast, but not impossibly so, and he had the arrogance of the endlessly regenerating. It wasn't impossible to lay hands on the Sage of the Six Paths. His skin felt cool and dry and somehow unreal beneath, palms sweaty with the exertion of battle, and her fingers dug into his flesh like she was Sude refusing to be dislodged from her lap. Chakra warped space and dissolved the barriers between the world and the void, or maybe it was a dark world crushed between them, like when you crumpled layers of fabric and it was her will and her body that shoved them both into a space that was narrower than the instinctive blink that usually concealed it from sight. She left him there in the dark, and returned to the world where she was assaulted by howling winds so strong as to almost be a negative pressure wave in a scene like something out of a nightmare. An enormous tornado of black fire swallowed the horizon like the goddess of destruction dancing, and Sakura thought for a moment that this was how she would end, not at her enemy's hands, but as collateral damage to the overwhelming might of Naruto and Sasuke's combined strength. Then she noticed that everywhere the earth was saturated with Hagoromo's chakra. The fire slid off like water from a waterfowl's feathers, and there was nothing that could burn except the air itself, and that was where that roaring wind was born. It yanked at her hair, and now that death wasn't quite as imminent, she briefly turned her attention to the white flickering in her peripheral vision. The heavy swing of her hair behind her had made her aware that her regeneration had done more than simply repair her skin. She had been braiding it loosely back and was grateful for it now. The tie binding it had been about 2/3 of the way down its length, somewhere just at the base of her neck. That tie now brushed against her upper thighs, the loose ends of her hair at her knees, and now she realized she shouldn't have been so anxious about those streaks. All of her hair had gone white at her scalp, and it was only further down her back that it began to regain its vibrant candy floss pink. Sakura sighed almost inaudibly, a little exhale through her teeth that made her bitten-through lip throb, and then let it go in favor of acknowledging Hamura. "We're not going to win, are we?" Sakura asked. It seemed something that one should say softly, shamefully, but she had to shout it to be heard above the wind. She already feeling the strange fluctuations that probably heralded Hagoroma clawing his way back from the dark world. Well, either that or that marriage of wind and fire was about to escape from her teammates' control and raise half this country to the ground and send the ash along the rivers to ruin the rest. "My brother was born a genius," Hamura replied. "And then he became someone who overshadowed even his own legends. It is not empty flattery when they call him the god of shinobi. If I thought that I could overcome him by sheer force, if I was willing to ignore the laws of heaven and earth, I would not have had to wait this long. I have spent these many years in the study of sealing for this moment, but I can't do it alone. Not without doing things that would only replace one sin with another. The amount of power it will require is beyond me as I am, even if I were to come fully to this side and expel this child of my line to make room for my own soul. It will require the kind of power only a sage can touch." Sakura's eyes flicked up at the black sky, where Naruto was burning like a golden star. "Not him," Hamura said softly, or as softly as he could and still be heard, which meant it was still said with some force. "You. Sealing is a subtle art. That is a powerful child, but he is young, impulsive, and looking at his jutsu, little practiced in paying attention to minute divergences in a technique. There will only be one good chance after that, everything will be blood and sacrifice. If this seal is successful, it will destroy that seal of yours and all those seals that it supports. It would kill him. For the sake of the world, please." He was watching her, as if waiting for her to hesitate for the sake of her own power, for fear of her own safety, and she was watching him in turn. For her, the sacrifice of the seal was nothing. The only question was whether she could trust this brother who had come out of nowhere. 1,000 years was a long time to learn how to lie, especially when you were only a spirit borrowing a body. But there weren't a lot of choices and there was no time to ask. She keyed her wireless headset and gave the order for Kakashi Senpai and Itaka to disengage and land somewhere safe. There would be an interruption in the seal. She didn't mention Sai by name, but she felt the shift in his presence in the seal network that she took as acknowledgement. "You didn't have to look at me like that. Konohagakure raises shinobi, not sycophants in some daimyo's court. If a soldier can save even some small part of the world by dying, do you think we wouldn't do it? Asking me to give up a little bit of power that I haven't even gotten used to yet isn't even a real sacrifice," Sakura said sharply, baring her teeth in a smile even as her insides fluttered with the panic of committing to such a decision without time or research. It felt like that first day when she'd learned to water walk, launching herself into the hazy sky with no real certainty she'd land well. Sakura felt so sharply alive when juxtaposed with the almost certain loss of this battle if things went awry that she thought that perhaps she would die of the adrenaline that washed through her and tried to make her fingers tremble. Hamura nodded solemnly at her, reaching out to brush the blood from her chin with his thumb, using it to sketch characters in the air between them. There was a resonance that pulsed between them and she had a seal appear in her mind, but it wasn't like any seal she'd known. The ones she had access to were few and far between, but there were certain commonalities. They were originally things of paper and ink, given life and force by chakra and blood. This was something more than that. Sakura crouched, bringing out blank scrolls from her storage and filling them with the characters that were limned with white light in her mind, making them real, positioning them to align to the 8 directions as she went to one knee over the point where they intersected. Spreading her taloned hand wide, the white scales glimmering with the shadow of black fire and red. The earth beneath her fingers was soft and loamy, grains of sand finding their way up beneath her nail beds as she closed her hand, her eyelids falling nearly closed as her gaze turned inward. Earth endures. There was a deep rumble, something she felt in her teeth, as the earth began to shift first in the deep places, then it was something that a person could hear with their earths as spires of rock ruptured the placid surface. This was not a land of mountains, but she ripped up the bones of the land and raised the 8-peaked rim of a caldera around them. Sakura could not see and had no way of knowing that there were standing stones that looked almost like people in glowing light at each of these peaks. Metal is remade without being destroyed. The earth birthed swords for her at the end of each of her scrolls, the dull, untempered or rich with potential energy. They hummed and sang, each resonating with the others until the whole became greater than the sum of its parts. Water flows without ceasing. Her array had swallowed the nearby river. Water could bring happiness and prosperity flowing in, when it flowed badly it brought disease and rot. It was an element of purification and transition, it was also a yin element to help offset Hagoroma's unbalanced yang constitution. Seen rushing above the ground or flowing hidden below, it changed the energy flows of the spiritual landscape. As attuned to the world as she was in this moment, with her third eye open, she could feel them as clearly as her own chakra channels. Wood begins again after death. Where the fire of Amaterasu had passed over, seeds began to sprout, tendrils spreading out from protective shells and greenery bursting forth on new mountainsides, anchoring the earth, filtering the water. Wind has no beginning and no end. Wind, driven by the heat of the fire, began to howl through these new peaks. There were places like this that, due to the uncanny geography, the wind blew in and could not easily escape again. It would create a fell, unhealthy place, from which souls could not easily escape, but creating such an undiscriminating trap deliberately would create the kind of negative karma that would take lifetimes to overcome. Trapping his brother's soul wasn't Hamura's intention. Instead, the wind blew continually sweet and fresh, a place where evil could not root and souls with ill intentions could not linger. Fire cannot be sated. Sakura stood from where she'd knelt, knee creaking with her weight, and then she was weightless, her whole body like a scarf tossed into the sky. And then she was a battle pennant snapping in the wind, her white scales gleaming as she rode the winds of the enormous fire tornado toward the roiling clouds above. Lightning snapped and snarled there and she gathered it around her like weaving a crown of flowers to wear in her hair, the pearl that glowed in place of her third eye in this form casting light as if it were the moon come down, and all the fires of Amaterasu followed her like a cloak of shadows as she rushed back toward the earth. Hagoromo was standing where she'd been kneeling, none the worse for his time in the dark world, and raised his hand against her. The void is invoked. The sound of their impact was a tsunami wave crashing down against a cliff face, and like that tsunami wave, when she met that immovable power, her consciousness broke. Kill your heroes. There was a handsome man bending over her, her head pillowed on his knees. She couldn't remember his name, but he had familiar eyes. Sakura wondered what he was doing in the no, that was open sky behind him. What the hunt Obito and Hagoromo, and then? Her eyes were stinging and she blamed it on the sun. I didn't win, did I? She asked softly. Hamura's smile was kind. No, he said. But look. She twisted her head, to see he was tugging gently on the leaves of a little tree to bring into her field of view. There was a single pink blossom drooping on its branches. Perhaps you didn't manage to kill him and send him safely back into the cycle of life and death, but you did seal away a great deal of his power. The spirit world and this one are no longer in immediate danger of war. Kaguya-sama's rest can continue undisturbed. You will have a little time to bloom beautifully before you face him again. This time he will be just a man, no more or less dangerous than a Jinchuriki, but not a monster well beyond your reach. He paused for a moment, as if his attention turned elsewhere, but his eyes never left hers. Your companions are coming. I only have time to beg one last favor. His hand gently grasped her wrist, sliding up to cup the palm of her hand as he bent his head and guided her first two fingers to where the manji of Niji's seal was currently exposed. Sakura gave a ragged gasp as another jutsu burned itself into her brain, chakra moving through seared and aching channels. The arms of the manji bent and bloomed, becoming a blossom that faded into his skin. She knew a version of the seal still remained, protecting his eyes from being used by any opportunist who knew a little medical ninjutsu, but she had cut the strings that bound him to the head of the Hyuga clan and erased the brand that marked him as part of a branch family. Sakura blinked and it wasn't only Niji's appearance rather than Hamura's, it was him behind the eyes too, staring down at her with a complicated expression. She managed to gather enough energy to smile wanly up at him, feeling her ears ringing and her extremities going cold as she faded into the silence once more. Kill your heroes. Itaka was weary and nearly numb as they finally drew within sight of Konohagakure's walls. Sakura was clasped close to his chest, still unconscious, but at least it was a peaceful sleep. She had seized twice on the journey and her heart had stopped once. He thought his heart had almost stopped with it, the memory making him grip her tighter before he forced himself to relax his fingers before he left bruises. He still felt very unsettled about everything, from Obito to the strange encounter that Hyuga-san had only been able to describe in part. He had been silently mulling over everything they had learned, undisturbed by his very subdued teammates. Even Naruto-san had been quiet and had not decided how it changed how he felt about the long miserable stretch of his life that had begun with the first rumors of rebellion in the Uchiha clan. Itachi was not so intent on Sakura's continued well-being, his own mental turmoil, and the approaching gauntlet of walking through Konohagakure's gates as a shinobi of the leaf again that he failed to notice how Sasuke had abruptly stopped walking. "Sasuke?" he asked. Sasuke was staring at the gates, his face set in hard, unyielding lines. "It's not finished." When his eyes blazed cherry non-red, all the hairs on Itachi's body pricked in foreboding. "I won't cross through that gate until that man is dead and our family is safe." And, ignoring the half-formed protests of Itachi and Naruto-san, Uchiha Sasuke summoned a hawk and abandoned the leaf once again. Kill your heroes. Chapter 73. Kintsugi, Part I. "You're still here?" Tsunade asked the Uchiha, who had his head bowed so deeply, forehead pressed against the back of hands, that he was nearly bent double. When he looked up and blinked hazily at her, she could see that his eyes weren't merely red-rimmed, there was a whole river network written red in his sclera, and the bruises beneath his eyes were emphasized by the exhausted grooves that aged him a decade. "I didn't want Sakura to wake up alone," he replied hoarsely. "I meant in Konoha," she replied. Itachi dropped his gaze to where Haruno Sakura was resting with all the serenity of medically induced sleep. Whatever she had been doing on that battlefield, it had scoured her channels and reserves until she had a capacity that could rival a Senju, but the assimilation and the shock had nearly killed her. If Tsunade had to guess, her body had been in so much pain it probably had lost the ability to process it as anything other than euphoria, as her own chakra burned through her like it was acid. And, of course, she'd been with a squad with a piss-poor level of medical training beyond gaping wounds, but even the special vision afforded by the Byakugan hadn't been able to detect her own chakra killing her. Tsunade didn't blame the Hyuga boy for that. Whatever her chakra had been doing before it became bent on mass cellular destruction, it probably hadn't looked much like any sort of baseline with which to compare the wavelength that had wreaked such silent devastation in her body before it had twisted back into a regenerative force. By the time Tsunade had seen her, it had been too late to do much more than see to it that she had a proper rest and treat the dehydration that was a common side effect of prolonged loss of consciousness in the field. She'd said as much to the hovering members of her team and had ordered them to disperse, though she'd allowed the Uchiha to remain at her side on the assumption that this might be one last guilty lingering before he took off after his brother. "I made promises to Sakura," he replied softly. "I don't belong only to myself any longer. That kind of decision I'm free to make it, but I know that it wouldn't be one that was forgiven." And he looked absolutely miserable with that knowledge. "Ah. Well," Tsunade replied coldly, glancing back to where Shikaka was leaning lazily against the door, "about that. On the matter of being forgiven, you realize that leaving without the prior authorization of his commanding officer Hatake Kakashi in this case means that your brother has become a missing nin." Again. Uchiha Itachi's shoulders fell at her harsh reminder. "I know." Tsunade stated at him for a long moment, still weighing in her mind the offer that she and Shikaka had negotiated between them. She didn't disagree with the idea that Otsutsuki Hagoromo remained a real threat to the village, but he'd vanished without a trail any of Hatake's squad had been able to trace. Other tracking specialists and she had never heard any report of Uchiha Sasuke even pretending to be one had already been dispatched within hours of Hatake's report arriving via Carrier Crow. Hatake had declared the mission finished. Uchiha Sasuke did not have the authority to countermand his field commander's decisions. It established a very poor precedent and stood to erode the military discipline that allowed the village to function if he was allowed to do as he wished without reprimand, but Tsunade was under no illusion about the casualties that would result from a mission to retrieve him. She was also under no illusions about the kind of Hokage she was. Tsunade, like all Hokage before her and all those that would follow, would make compromises she didn't necessarily like to save face and to save lives. Konohagakure could issue a mission for your brother, an open-ended one, filed as if it was issued on the day that you returned to the village and I'd simply forgotten to send it down to the mission office in all the fuss, what with my commander of the military police returning slightly mangled, she said coolly, crossing her arms beneath her breasts. In return, when you marry, Harano Sakura will become the head of the Uchiha clan. All of its assets will be transferred to her and will remain under her sole control for the rest of your lives, though she will be allowed to grant you the minor privileges usually accorded to the wife of the head. As an outsider, I don't have the authority to interfere with clan affairs, so I can't order you to do anything and there will be no official record in both Shikaku and I will deny any such meddling, regardless of what you decide. She watched his body language to gauge his reply. It was not a kind compromise and was just fractionally better than stealing his clan outright and handing it to someone she could trust. Tsunade would have been furious if anyone had even suggested such a thing, despite having earned the shame and disappointment of her own clan with her choices, but there weren't very many options for survival left for a clan that had burned so many bridges. If he left his brother a criminal and made himself one in Sasuke's defense, and she couldn't imagine him standing idly aside if she issued the order to have his brother brought in, there was absolutely nothing stopping her from stripping the name from the clan and handing over its land and assets as reward to one of her own trusted subordinates to strengthen the village. It was a course of action that had doubtless been suggested many times to the third, even before Uchiha Sasuke betrayed the village. She had certainly had to hear about it often enough. Tsunade expected anger, but found only relief. His shoulders were still slumped with exhaustion, but they weren't hunched defensively, and the line of tension in his brows smoothed out as he gave her a smile that was so defeated that it might have made her feel guilty if she wasn't clear that the Uchiha had brought this end upon themselves. Is that all? He sighed. The money means nothing and our name is worth less than nothing if it becomes known that Sasuke defected for a second time. At least in Sakura's hands, it might be associated with something other than madness and greed. I do have something to ask of the Senju clan, though it was your grandfather who built the original compound that burned when Madara rebelled. Do you know if the plans are still extant? Do I look like I've had time to be looking for old plans in the Senju basement? But it's not an impossible request. You want to restore it as your last act as head of the Uchiha clan. Itachi nodded, glancing over at Sakura again. When Madara burnt the first manor to conceal the secrets he could not carry away and to punish the clansmen who refused to betray the village, the next head had the clan rebuild with ordinary houses as a signal of humility and sincerity. It was supposed to be much harder to plot rebellion if you had to skulk from house to do it. At the time, there were still many clansmen, so they didn't need an estate to give them status. But what the Uchiha clan has left now is a facade that will need maintained. Besides, he said dryly, Hatake-san has a lot of dogs. At this, Tsunade grinned. What, you don't want a running commentary on your sex life from the Ninken in the next room over? She outright laughed as Itachi's ears and neck burned, but he didn't deny it. Kill your heroes. Sakura woke to joints that ached like they had when she'd been meddling with her height, and her teeth felt all scummy, her mouth sour and her scalp itchy. Overall, it was the kind of everyday misery that indicated that she'd probably survived sealing the Sage of Six Paths. Surreal. That was the only word she had to describe that awful mess, like discovering a figure out of the stories of your childhood was real, and not only was he real, he wasn't a hero after all. Thinking of the title only heightened her strange sense of dissociation with the battle. Most of her encounters with death clung tight to her consciousness, as if she was in danger of falling back into that moment if she didn't grip tight to the present with both hands. But this was as if some stranger had worn her skin and fought that battle, making alliances with ancient ancestral spirits and flown without wings as a fully manifested dragon. But some stranger strong enough to yank mountains up out of the earth and overwhelm a whirlwind of fire and reshape rivers would also have been strong enough to win. She had lost, so Sakura knew that it had really been her beneath those scales. It was not the first time she'd lost to an opponent's overwhelming force, though she knew it wasn't true. It sometimes seemed her career was one long lesson in defeat. But that meant her heart was steady against the disappointment, and she only quietly clenched her teeth and forced her protesting body upright. If you'd stayed down for another 10 minutes, I could have talked Shikaku into a real drink to pass the time. Tsunade-sama's voice came from her bedside. On the other hand, that would have been another 10 minutes listening to him try to talk me into some sort of strategy game that he's going to win and is going to put me to sleep, so good job saving me from that. Sakura was still blinking away the surprise of finding the Hokage herself at her bedside as Tsunade-sama unceremoniously took the entire tea service that was on the table between her and Shikamaru's father and placed it closer to Sakura. "Here. Have some tea. It comes highly recommended by some people," she said, rolling her eyes, but her hands were gentle and steady as she made certain that Sakura had a stable grip before releasing the cup. Shikamaru's father was smiling faintly into his own teacup. "Now, let's have a chat about what happened after I sent you off in a megakure." Sakura glanced over at Shikamaru's father. As a child in the academy, she'd found his appearance very imposing, which had made her even more timid than usual. Ino hadn't been spending much time with her future teammates in those days, and then it had ceased to matter, but now his scars didn't obscure the right kindness of his expression. "Don't worry about Shikaku. This will all become his headache in 4 days, so I've briefed him on everything. You and Hatake are out of the village so often I don't know if you've met him in his capacity as Jounin commander, and I know that he's seen your service record, but I don't know if he's met you when you were conscious, so take this as your formal introduction if you haven't met each other properly. She was close with Inoichi's daughter in the academy, but we only saw each other in passing. I remember you always called me Nara-san, but you can go ahead and just call me Shikaku, Sakura-chan. We'll be working together for a while," he said, then sighed. "It makes me feel old, having a girl the same age as my boy serving as my commander of military police. Though that might just be because our esteemed Godame went and persuaded my wife before she ever brought up becoming the 6th to me." The pointed look he directed at Tsunade-sama only made her smile. "It's not entrapment when it's strategy, Shikaku. Now, let's hear what happened during the incident that we're calling Operation Firestorm for convenience, and when you're done, I'll have Shikaku brief you on what you missed." Sakura nodded and then did as she was bid, recounting everything that she could remember without holding anything back. Tsunade-sama and Shikaku-sama listened with thoughtful eyes, Shikaku-sama asking questions to clarify as he saw fit, Tsunade-sama looking rather smug every time he did so. When her report had finished, Shikaku-sama relayed what had occurred outside the scope of her personal battle, sometime after she had given the order for Senpai and Itachi to withdraw, but before she'd stolen the Black Fire, Naruto and Sasuke had been left to face an opponent whose real danger wasn't in the number of tailed beasts sealed within him. Rather, it was in the fact that he himself had been deceived into fighting Higoromo's war after being left for dead by his village, which made him desperate in a way that sang to Naruto's soul. But he had also been there on the night that had ruined Sasuke's life and knew how to use words to twist that knife. Sasuke's temper had never been precisely stable, and whatever Orochimaru's seal had done to him physiologically, compounded by his time under a master more interested in how he'd break than in his long-term well-being, without Kakashi-senpai or his brother there to temper him, Sasuke hadn't been interested in hearing Obito's life story to the point he was ready to remove Naruto from the field of combat entirely to keep him out of the way. Not by killing him. Sasuke was still convinced he was on their side, apparently, though how he interpreted that was somewhat different from how Sakura saw things, but perhaps she was just overly conventional, but by using his eyes to temporarily seal the Nine-Tails chakra. This forced Naruto to rely entirely on his sage energy, forcing him to the ground just long enough for Sasuke to make what would probably have been a suicide run toward his opponent if Kakashi-senpai hadn't intervened. It hadn't mattered that he'd only seen the jutsu performed once at a distance, through fire and smoke and chakra constructs, with no hand signs to speak of. Kakashi-senpai had lived up to his name. The copycat nin had stolen the technique used to bind the Nine-Tails and used it to suppress his old teammate and all the tailed beasts that Akatsuki had managed to steal. That had been when Sakura had come, bringing the fire and riding the lightning, and mostly being a gargantuan-scaled distraction, and it hadn't mattered whether Kakashi-senpai had intended to bring Obito back to the village to face the justice of a cage and bring the tailed beasts under Konohagakure's control once more, or if he'd meant to meet his old companion in battle. Sasuke had found his own sort of justice, written with the edge of a blade, leaving the safety of his chakra construct so that he could move hidden in Sakura's shadow. And then, what was done was done. Until Sasuke had decided that they weren't done, and the mission wasn't finished until he decided it was. That idiot, she breathed without her usual sharpness, still strangely disconnected from her own reality, but she felt her stomach dip with more than anger. It was probably that they had wanted to debrief her alone, but neither Senpai nor Itachi were at her side. She wasn't worried about Senpai in quite the same way she was worried about Itachi. It was an old wound that had been opened, but maybe that would finally give it an opportunity to heal. He had likely coerced some poor soul into buying him a meal and was presently buried under a heap of ninkin, reading a smut novel and deliberately not thinking about it. If he was feeling especially self-destructive, he would be doing some sort of grueling physical training somewhere no one could see and realize that the infamous Hatake Kakashi also had to train to keep his skills sharp. He was no longer the same lost child who'd given himself over to Umbu looking for death or absolution. She was only afraid that Itachi was still the same self-sacrificing son of the Uchiha clan that he had always been. Go Dame-sama, Itachi, he is probably just as silly as you're giving him credit for, but there's something to be said for Uchiha men, whatever their shortcomings. Take it as a gift of advice for your upcoming nuptials. They're loyal partners, and when I say that, I mean obsessively. When I was your age, all the Kunoichi knew two things about the boys from the Uchiha clan: they never produced bastards, and they could be right bastards once they became fixated on someone. While they won't stray even if they once see you twice in 10 years, they expect the same kind of loyalty. It's linked to their jujitsu, or at least that's the excuse they've been using when they use clan law to punish cheating spouses. So be absolutely certain he's what you want, Tsunade-sama cautioned. Sakura considered that, and her expression must have given her away. So you're the type that's pleased by that. Well, that's good. Considering that I sent your swain to get some sleep and go make arrangements to build you a manor. The two of you will have to wait to marry, though, since your whole squad seems intent on causing me headaches. What do you mean, Tsunade-sama? I mean that what you did to Hyagoniji's seal has already caused enough of a fuss with the Hyaga clan without complicating it as, and she raised her hands to mockingly make air quotes, an action undertaken by the Uchiha clan to undermine the traditions of said clan and the authority of their patriarch. Now, mind you, this was from a passel of their elders, not their patriarch himself. Shikaku took up the thread of the conversation. After the death of his brother, Hayashi became a much more reserved man, but he's being suspiciously quiet about the whole thing. I suspect he's looking for a way to save the clan face, acquire the seal you used, and seal an alliance all in one fell swoop. Marriage is the obvious answer for the elders, especially since it would also spite the Uchiha clan, but we'll see what sort of offer we end up with. Now, there are other matters we'll have to be prepared for, before we officially take office, but we'll do that somewhere other than your hospital room and after you've had a chance to check on your team. If you come over to the Nara estate for lunch tomorrow, we'll talk then. And if you happen to see Shikamaru, tell him his mother is still looking for him, and the longer he hides, the worse it's going to be. Sakura blinked at him. Did Shikamaru do something wrong? Only being born brilliant but absolutely without motivation. I've mostly resigned myself to it, but when his mother heard that you'd been appointed to lead the military police, she thought it was a good time to start comparing him to other people's children. Which is probably good for him, because that child needs to do more than just drift through life, but he has the ability to sleep anywhere, so it makes finding him difficult. But he's been acting strangely since the crush. See you tomorrow, Sakura-chan. It was strange to think that though they were the same age, Shikamaru was still hiding from his parents and responsibility beyond what someone could force on him, while she was meeting his father tomorrow for a discussion between a cage and the keeper of his law. Life was like a river. Some people were caught in the current and swept ahead of others who were carried more gently in the eddies, but they would all in the end arrive at the sea. Kill your heroes. After Sakura had been discharged, she opened the door to the hall to find two people sitting against the wall next to her door. Naruto? And Hinata-san? She queried. Hello, Hinata-san. Naruto, you know there are waiting rooms. With things like chairs. She eyed the papers scattered around his knees. And tables. Naruto grinned up at her, and it was only slightly forced, but his voice was hoarse when he answered. Yeah, but I didn't want to miss seeing you before you left. The medics said they'd probably discharge you when Tsunade-sama was finished talking to you. Did you hear about Sasuke? I heard, was Sakura's blunt reply, but then she relented. Come on. We'll talk about somewhere more comfortable and less in people's way than a hospital hallway. Hinata-san, we'll have to bother you to choose somewhere to eat. The other girl looked surprised to be invited. No, it's fine if the two of you need to talk alone. I was just helping Naruto-san fill out some forms. I don't want to be in the way. If he's making you help him with paperwork, he should at least treat you. What do you like? Hinata-san prevaricated, tucking a lock of hair behind her hair, flushing faintly across her cheekbones. Sweet things. Like zenzei or cinnamon rolls. Cinnamon rolls, Sakura replied, smirking slightly at her, which made the heiress blink innocently back at her and Naruto look up at her with confusion from where he was collecting his papers. Sakura just shook her head slightly. I like sweet things too. So, why don't you introduce us to your favorite shop? Alright, Hinata-san said shyly, but her expression said she was pleased to be asked as she led the way as they exited the hospital. So what sort of forms are you working on? Sakura asked as they walked, taking in the remarkable amount of repair that had already been carried out so far as the buildings themselves were concerned. Oh, these. Naruto looked down at the sheaf of paper he had in his grip. These are the application forms for the teaching program at the academy. Aside from continuing fieldwork, there's like 3 years of classes you have to take. And I can't let you get too far ahead, so I'm starting as soon as I can get these filed. Hinata is already in the program, so she's helping me. I didn't know you wanted to be a teacher, Sakura said cautiously. For once, there was nothing shy about Hinata-san's expression as she turned to smile at her. That was the look of someone finally free of some shackle that they had always expected to wear. I didn't know that I would be able to choose to do something I wanted to do when we were in the academy, but my younger sister was formally recognized as the heiress of the Hyuga clan. That means that I don't have to try to live up to expectations and responsibilities that would have made me into someone I never wanted to be. This way I can still be me, without feeling that there's anything wrong with that. And I'll be good at it. I'm good at watching people. At seeing what they're good at even when they don't see it for themselves. She said this without raising her voice or changing to a more strident tone, but even though her voice remained gentle, every word was full of confidence. I want to work with older children as a combat instructor. Sakura considered the advantages of having the Byakugan when managing a practice field full of children and suddenly found it more understandable that even those children without a strong jujitsu in their family were usually remarkably talented in hand-to-hand. It would also be extremely useful in seeing what exactly a student was doing wrong with their chakra when practicing jutsu. She did wonder if she'd had to leverage some guilt at having been divested of the heiress position to get her family to allow her to put that desire to teach to use outside of their clan. That's actually really brilliant, she told the other girl. I'm sure you'll do well. Hinata might have been pleased by that, but it was Naruto's cheerful affirmation that she would be fantastic that made her turn almost as red as Itaka's eyes. Check the description for the links to the author.